I lost everything in a single year. My wife, my kids, my dignity. She left me for a man who stole not just my work, but my life. I was stripped down to nothing, with only a rundown house and a pickup truck to my name. How did it all spiral out of control so quickly? They took my family 600 miles away, leaving me with the ghosts of what used to be. But I wasn't dead yet. Desperation turned into rage, and rage became the fuel for my rebirth. I'm Gerald Murphy, and this is the story of how I clawed my way back from the abyss. Year 1. Gerald Murphy knew he was in a tough spot. He liked to be called Gerald, but most people, including his ex-wife and former boss, called him Jerry. He tried to be okay with it, but it still bothered him sometimes. However, what people called him was the least of his problems. What really worried him was what a 35-year-old man like him was supposed to do after losing his dignity, reputation, job, family, and most of his savings because of his divorce. The biggest issue was that he honestly didn't understand how things had gone so wrong. Some people could have told him, but he might not have grasped their words. They might say he was Mr. Loyalty, always dependable, the kind of guy everyone could count on. But they would also say he was so focused on his work that he kept others at a distance. He didn't spend time with coworkers or go to many social events. Because of this, he had helped several not-so-great bosses look better than they were, and he missed out on promotions because he wasn't part of the in crowd. These traits drove his wife of 10 years to leave him. She moved on with one of his former bosses who was known for taking credit for others' work and treating them poorly. Their marriage and job move took Gerald's 2 young kids to a busy city 600 miles away. Gerald was now alone in a smaller town, with just a job, a little house, his pickup truck, and no clue how his life had fallen apart so quickly. Then, the economy took a dive, and Gerald became an unemployed 35-year-old with little chance of finding a good job anytime soon. The factory closure came as a shock, but he did get a year's pay as severance and a good reference. A month later, he realized he was heading towards bankruptcy and needed to take action. He sold his house, getting some money and freeing himself from a mortgage. He found a 5-acre piece of land 80 miles away that he could buy outright and purchased a 1-bedroom cabin that had been taken back by the bank. Now he had a place to live that didn't cost much and some cash to live on. But that was all he had. His life had turned into a small cabin on 5 acres and no clear future. One night, as he sat watching TV, he heard a news commentator who made a lot more money in a single year than most do in their whole lives spend nearly an hour saying that people should stop complaining about the economy and just go work hard to be successful like he was. He had brought in 3 or 4 fancy experts to back up what he said. Just before the show ended, Gerald pulled out his small gun and shot the television 3 times. For a short moment, Gerald thought about turning the gun on himself, but that idea quickly left his mind. He put the gun back in the drawer. The next morning, he drove into town and bought a used garden tiller, some compost, and a mix of vegetable seeds. He spent the whole week, from morning to evening, working on a piece of land close to his cabin where he planted a garden. He wanted to make sure he had food for himself. On his next trip to town, he noticed a sign for an estate sale. Without much thought, he decided to check it out to see if he could find anything helpful. Unfortunately, the sale was almost over, and only a few random items were left. He spoke with the person in charge of the sale and learned that the man who had passed away had left the house to his son, who didn't really want it and planned to sell it. The person asked Gerald if he knew anyone who could come and clean out the barn filled with items and take down a small old shed. Without hesitation, Gerald offered to do it for $200. The man gave him the money and asked him to finish within a week. For the next week, Gerald carefully took down the shed and loaded the wood into his truck, stacking it behind the cabin. When he started on the barn, he was surprised by what he found among the clutter. It was clear that the seller hadn't bothered to sort through the messy pile. He had just told Gerald to clear it all out. After hauling the junk to the dump and making 3 trips to recycle broken metal, which earned him another $150, Gerald looked at the other things he had found. Besides the wood from the shed, He had saved 30 metal fence poles, a long roll of fencing, several old but useful garden tools, and his best find, a small trailer hidden under everything else. The tires were broken, but he managed to bring it home. Everything needed some cleaning and fixing, but now he had some materials to work with. Since his television was now just junk at the dump, he listened to the radio while he worked in the garden and fixed the things he had found. In the evenings, he enjoyed music and reading. Over the next 2 months, the estate sale person called him twice more for similar jobs at 2 other places. He gladly accepted the work and earned $200 for each job. He also made some extra money by recycling metal and gathered more wood, siding, and metal roofing for his building projects. He found a lawnmower that someone said was broken, but after changing the oil and replacing the spark plug, it worked fine. Around this time, his garden started to grow well. He quickly realized he needed to learn how to save some of his vegetables for later. The local library helped by giving him 2 books about canning and preserving food. Soon, he was cooking and preparing his harvest for storage. His only issue was that he didn't have enough space to keep everything. To fix this, he used some of the wood and materials he collected to build a strong storage shed. He built it partly underground into a hill that faced north, which kept it cool in the summer and dry during the rainy seasons. He created a routine to work for 6 days and then take the 7th day off to clean his home, do laundry, and handle other chores. From another library book, he learned to bake bread, so he made enough for the week on his day off. Every week he wrote a letter to each of his children, sending them off without knowing if they ever arrived, since he never received any replies. Eventually, the letters returned, marked, "Moved, no forwarding address." Undeterred, he continued writing but stopped paying for postage, opting instead to keep the letters in 2 boxes, 1 for each child. One day in town, he discovered a small farmer's market that opened only on Saturdays. He decided that Saturday would be his shopping day, and he went to the market first. There, he bought vegetables and other items he couldn't grow himself. He also learned that some women sold a variety of baked goods at the market. Inspired by this, he began baking 10 loaves of bread each week to sell. The women offered lighter breads, while he preferred to make thicker, darker varieties like multigrain and rye. On his first weekend selling, he managed to sell 6 loaves for $5 each. Following that, demand grew, and he often sold out completely. He then designated Thursday and Friday for bread making, mixing the dough on Thursday evening to let it rise and baking all day Friday. This allowed him to sell 15 to 20 loaves each week. Though profits weren't massive, they were enough to cover meat and other essentials. Most importantly, these efforts connected him with many locals, helping him become a recognized member of the community. In a relaxed atmosphere, people soon noticed his positive traits. Although he was quiet, his warm and charming personality shone through. The women at the market particularly appreciated the shy man who baked tasty rye bread. When they learned that he was also a gardener and skilled with his hands, several asked for his assistance in building raised garden beds. Many of these women were older and found it challenging to work directly with the ground. Most were retired widows or had husbands who were unable or willing to assist with simple tasks. Gerald was happy to help and began constructing these garden boxes from his wood supply. He would deliver them to their homes and set them up as requested. Additionally, he bought new tires for his trailer and made repairs with a welder. He also discovered a more affordable source for bulk compost, moving away from purchasing small bags. Over the next 2 months, he built and delivered 12 of these beds, charging $75 each. While working, many women asked for help with other small repairs around their homes. As a result, he often left each house with between $100 and $150. This continued until the holiday season, when activity began to slow down. Finally, he had some time to tackle chores he had been putting off. During this break, Gerald reviewed his finances and was pleasantly surprised. After buying the land and mobile home, he realized he had about $10,000 left. By tallying everything, he discovered he had $12,000 in his savings account. He had managed to live simply for the first 9 months without a regular job and even grew his savings. This didn't even include the tools and supplies he had collected. As he finished reviewing everything, he began to cry. His tears shifted from feelings of sadness to ones of gratitude and joy for making it through. As a Christmas present to himself, he got an internet connection to access information online. After years, he went into town for a community Christmas event, bringing 5 loaves of bread to share. People were glad to see him and introduced him to more friends. One of these new acquaintances was his neighbor. He had known someone lived next door but had never taken the time to meet them. His neighbor turned out to be a single mother about his age, along with her 8-year-old daughter. The woman introduced herself as Gwen Lambert and her daughter as Sherilyn. During their chat, Gerald learned that Gwen was a school teacher in town, which explained why he hadn't seen them much during the day. Sherilyn was quiet and shy, just like he was. Before they left, they exchanged phone numbers and said they would call each other if they needed help. 2 days later, he received a call from her. She told him that her brother and sister-in-law were supposed to come for Christmas dinner, but they had to cancel because of an emergency. She mentioned that she had made too much food for just the 2 of them and asked if he wanted to join them for dinner on Christmas Day. He hesitated at first, but then agreed. He asked if he could bring some bread or something. She said that was fine and told him dinner would be at 1 o'clock, so he could come over any time after that. He took a shower and put on clean jeans and a shirt. He grabbed the loaf of bread and headed to her house just after noon. As he walked, he noticed what looked like steam coming from a window. When he realized it was smoke, he ran and burst through the door near the smoking window. He found Gwen sitting on the kitchen floor, visibly upset. The stove was charred and covered in water and fire extinguisher foam. "Are you and Sherilyn okay?" he asked. Through her tears, Gwen nodded. "Okay, let's get you out of here." He helped her up and took her to the back porch, sitting her in a lawn chair. Then he found Sherilyn, who was frightened in the living room. He led her outside and sat her next to her mother. After making sure they were safe, he went back inside to check the kitchen. The gas stove had clearly caught fire and made a mess. The wall behind it was damaged from smoke and water, but most of the kitchen was still all right. He turned off the gas and unplugged the stove from the wall. The biggest loss was the stove, but everything else could be cleaned up. He went back outside and sat down next to Gwen, who had calmed down. "I'm sorry, Gerald. The turkey is over there on the grill keeping warm, but everything else is ruined," she said. "Hey, you 2 are okay, and that's what matters. The damage isn't too bad, but the stove is gone. We can take the turkey to my place and finish the meal there if you want." "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering. My place is small, but I think we can all fit and still have a nice dinner." "All right, if you really don't mind. I don't think I'm ready to clean up that mess today. We can clean it up tomorrow. I can help replace some of the wall, and then we can look at getting a new stove." She gave a small smile, seeming grateful while also a bit reserved, then nodded her head. They placed the turkey on a big plate, and the 3 of them got into Gwen's car. They drove a short way to Gerald's cabin. As he led them inside, Gerald said to Sherilyn, "I'm sorry, but I don't have a TV. I usually listen to music. You can use the computer to find something fun." She nodded, feeling a little shy, and replied, "Thank you." Gwen looked around the cabin and saw that it was tidy and nice. With Gerald's help, they opened some canned foods and cooked different vegetables for dinner. By the time they sat down, the kitchen smelled wonderful with the fresh veggies and turkey. Everyone felt happy and ready to eat. Gwen and Sherilyn both commented on how delicious the vegetables were, while Gerald complimented the turkey. After dinner, Gerald took Sherilyn around his garden and storage room. Sherilyn was busy on the computer exploring a world of interesting things. Meanwhile, Gwen and Gerald sat on his small deck, sipping tea and sharing their stories. Gwen told Gerald that she and her husband bought the house next door 3 years ago with plans to fix it up. But then, her husband lost his job because of the economy. He found another job far away, but it paid less. Gwen stayed at home with Sherilyn since she had her own job. Things seemed better until her husband stopped calling. When she found out what happened, her life turned upside down again. He had lost that job too, started drinking, and ended up in a difficult situation. He hurt someone who then retaliated. He survived, but had been in jail for 4 months. A lawyer told Gwen he might have to go to prison for a couple of years. Because of this, Gwen had to cut back on many things, including homeowners insurance for their house. She worried about how she would replace the stove. Gerald listened carefully, nodding. He said he understood her situation and would look around to see if he could find a stove for her. She thanked him for his help and asked about his story. He shared what he could, explaining his life as best as he could. When they left, Gerald asked them to come back for breakfast in the morning before he and Gwen started cleaning up. Gwen agreed, but said she would bring sausage and eggs. Gerald happily accepted, and they made plans. They arrived just before 8 a.m. Gerald made fresh biscuits and sausage gravy while Gwen cooked the sausage and scrambled eggs. They worked well together in the small kitchen, and breakfast turned out great for everyone. Gerald gave Gwen some bell peppers and onions to mix with the eggs. Both Gwen and Sherilyn enjoyed the biscuits and gravy, something they had never tried before. After 9 o'clock, they went to Gwen's house to start cleaning up. The first thing Gerald did was take the old stove outside and put it in the back of his truck. He planned to take it to the metal recycling center the next day. He thought he would get about $20 for it because it was old and heavy. Then, he and Gwen cleaned the floor and cabinets. After she made sandwiches for lunch, Gerald began taking down the old wall board. He found some of the wooden beams inside the wall were damaged and needed to be replaced, along with some insulation. The next morning, after stopping at the recycling center, he went to the building supply store and bought what he needed. By the time he stopped for the day, he had fixed the beams and put in new insulation. He planned to put up the wallboard the next morning. Gwen and Sherilyn came to his house for breakfast and dinner each day, and they had lunch at Gwen's house while they worked. After the wallboard was up, he told Gwen he needed to run an errand but would be back in time for dinner. She smiled and said she would take care of dinner. Gerald then drove 50 miles to a thrift store he had heard about and found a gas stove that was only 3 years old. The old owners had donated it because it didn't match their new kitchen colors. Gerald bought it for $100 and covered it with a tarp from the light rain that had started. When he got home, Gwen was already in the kitchen making a roast with potatoes and other vegetables. The three of them enjoyed another great meal, made even better when Gerald put a loaf of bread in the oven. The warm bread and delicious smell made everything feel just right. The next morning, he backed his truck to their door before they had come down for breakfast. After knocking and being greeted by Gwen in her robe, he unloaded the stove and installed it in less than an hour. Gwen was amazed that he found one and set it up so easily. That morning they cooked breakfast on the new stove, and Gwen was thrilled with its features. She expressed her gratitude when Gerald turned it on, and it lit up perfectly. Finally, she asked him how much she owed him for the stove, shocked to learn it was only $100. She had thought it would cost around $300 for a stove in worse shape. He asked her to pay him back $20 a month, which she really liked and agreed to. After breakfast, Gwen mentioned that she had been invited to a New Year's party at a friend's house. However, she couldn't find someone to take care of Sherilyn. Gerald offered to stay with Sherilyn while she went to the party. Once she was sure he genuinely wanted to do it, she agreed. They checked with Sherilyn and decided they would stay at Gerald's cabin so Sherilyn could use the computer. Gwen had a computer too, but she had to stop using the internet to save money. Gwen dropped Sherilyn off at 7 o'clock and went to the party. Sherilyn was excited when Gerald said they would make homemade pizzas for dinner. They worked together and she made her pizza just the way she liked. While they ate, Gerald chatted with her about school and what was happening in her life. She shared that she missed her dad, but knew he wouldn't be home for a long time. Gerald felt a little sad thinking about his own kids, whom he also wouldn't see for a while. After dinner, they played some games, and then he showed her how to play some games on the computer. She started trying them out while he settled down to read. A little before 11 o'clock, he heard a car pull up, which was quite unusual. When he opened the door, he saw Gwen get out with a bottle of sparkling juice. She smiled and said she had fun at the party, but decided to come spend New Year's with them instead of waiting another hour with her friends. They opened the juice and toasted to each other. Sherilyn got a glass of grape juice and joined in. When midnight came, they shared warm embraces all around. Gwen and Sherilyn left soon after, since Sherilyn was getting tired. Year 2 Gerald spent New Year's Day building an outdoor brick oven from a design he found online. He thought the wood heat would make his breads taste better. On Saturday, he went to the farmer's market and sold all 20 loaves he had baked. The market was only open on the first Saturday of every month during winter and would start again every weekend in April. That night, Gwen called and invited him over for dinner on Sunday. She planned to make enchiladas and tacos. With school starting again on Monday, she felt this would be a nice way to wrap up the holiday season. Gerald agreed, and they had a great dinner on Sunday night. On Monday, a cold front came in, dropping the temperature to around freezing. He had been telling people he had a lot of seasoned firewood if anyone needed some. His phone started ringing Monday morning, and he spent most of the week delivering loads of wood. Overall, he made nearly $1,000 that week, which made him feel happy since his bread sales had dropped with fewer customers at the farmer's market. He hadn't gotten any calls for raised bed gardens in over a month. Hoping for more work, he built a dozen garden frames that would be ready for spring. The cold weather stopped him from finishing his oven, but he used his time to look for new bread recipes. With school starting again on Monday, he didn't see much of Gwen and Sherilyn throughout the week. They did talk on the phone. He invited them over for dinner on Friday, and Gwen accepted, saying she would invite him over on Sunday. This became their regular plan unless something else came up, which didn't happen very often. As January turned into February, calls for raised beds started coming in. Since he had the frames ready, he could spend less time setting up someone else's garden and still have time to plant his lettuce, potatoes, and onions. After finishing his work, he had an idea. One afternoon, Gwen and Sherilyn came home from school to find a neat garden prepared along the fence that separated their backyards. A quick phone call confirmed that he had tilled the garden and added compost, making it ready for planting. The next day, Sherilyn didn't have school because it was a teacher workday, so they decided that she would help him plant their garden. Gwen had mentioned that she wanted a garden but didn't have the time or tools to set one up, although she thought she could take care of it if she had one. Now, she had her garden. A month later, when spring break came, Gwen told him they would be away for several days. Her husband had a trial, and she felt they should be there for him. Gerald understood and wished them safe travels, saying he would take care of their place. After they left, Gerald felt lonely for a bit until his phone rang again. Soon he was busy with calls until they returned the following weekend. On Thursday night, Gwen called, and he could tell she was trying hard to sound cheerful. She said they would be home on Friday night but might arrive late. He told her to just come to his place, and he would have dinner ready when they got there. She thanked him for his kindness and promised that she would treat him to a meal on Sunday. They arrived at Gerald's house at 7 o'clock. He had prepared the ingredients for pizza, so all they had to do was add their favorite toppings and put them in the oven. He noticed the stress on Gwen's face, and Sherilyn, who normally spoke a lot, was unusually quiet. He guessed that their trip had been tough and not very rewarding. So he decided not to ask questions and focused on making dinner. As a result, the meal was calm, but by the time they left for home, he could see some of the stress had eased. As she left, Gwen softly told him she would share more on Sunday. Gerald just nodded and wished them a good night. Saturday was busy at the farmer's market. He sold half of his bread as oven-baked and the other half as brick oven-baked. Both kinds sold out, but he asked the customers who bought the brick oven loaves to let him know what they thought of the new way of baking. Many regulars smiled and said they expected it to be good and would give their opinions later. He didn't see Gwen or Sherilyn when he returned home, but he chose to give them some space, thinking they just needed time to themselves. On Sunday, he spent the day working in his garden, pulling weeds from his onions and potatoes when he heard Gwen's voice. "I hope we didn't upset you on Friday night. It has been a tough week and the drive back was difficult." "I figured that out. I hope you both are okay." "We will be fine. It was just a shock to hear everything." He seemed down and looked like he had lost a lot of weight. He was happy to see Sherry but felt shy and embarrassed around her. The trial didn't take long. It ended before noon, and the jury found him guilty before 2 o'clock. The next day, the judge gave him a 5-year sentence. His lawyer says he could be out in 3 years if he stays out of trouble in jail. We kind of prepared for this, but it still hit hard when we heard it. We talked that night and decided to keep doing our best like always, but it's still really tough on Sherry. She knows what happened but can't fully understand it. I think Sherry and I are alike in that way. It takes me a long time to understand things that happen to me, too. I would probably feel better if I could quickly decide who to blame and move on from my confusion. Gwen gave him a small smile. I can't see you as someone who quickly judges others. Your kindness and acceptance of people and situations is really a strength, even if you think it's a weakness. All Gerald could say was a weak, thanks. Anyway, I need to go to the store for a few things. Do you need anything while I'm in town? No thanks. I picked up most of what I need yesterday after the market. Okay, we'll have dinner ready around 6:30. I hope Sherry feels a bit better tonight. I'll be there, and if she doesn't, that's okay. It's tough on you, but I can only imagine how much harder it is for her. See, I'm not sure I could look at it that way. Gerald didn't know how to reply. He simply gave her a quick hug, and she went back to her house while he returned to pulling weeds. Yet her words stayed in his mind. He realized that he usually didn't jump to conclusions, but he wasn't sure why. His parents had been understanding people, though they could be judgmental at times. He always tried to understand a situation before deciding how he felt about it. Sometimes he felt this was a flaw in his personality. Some people, like his ex-wife, thought he was indecisive. Was he indecisive? He didn't know the answer. That night, they had a nice dinner. Sherilyn seemed a bit brighter than she had on Friday, but she was still quiet. He spoke to her, and she responded, but there wasn't much energy in her words. He hoped that going back to school and being with her friends would make her feel better. Gwen asked if Sherry could stay with him for a bit on Thursday because she had a training class that would take several hours. Gerald agreed right away. He liked the gentle girl and thought she liked him too. At the start of the week, he was busy cleaning out a barn before the property was sold. While working on this project, he found some tools and discovered an old tractor. It didn't look worn out like many old tractors. He asked the owner about it and learned that it had been there since he bought the place. The owner had wanted to fix it up but never had the time. When they finished speaking, the seller offered Gerald the tractor instead of payment for his work. He happily accepted, but needed to rent a trailer to take it home. While loading, he found a box of parts that had never been used. In the end, he had a tractor and more wood and building materials to add to his collection. As he was unloading the wood, he realized that leaving it outside was making it worse. Plus, the tractor really needed a roof over it. He looked online and found different designs for building barns. One design caught his attention, so he printed it out. He spent most of Wednesday night adjusting the drawing to fit what he needed and then planned a layout that would work for him. On Thursday, he marked the area where he wanted to build. By the afternoon, he had dug a hole for the first post. He paused when he heard the school bus drop off Sherilyn. She walked down the driveway with her backpack. When she came up to him looking at the barn he imagined, she started asking questions. What was he doing? How big would it be? Why was he building it? He took her around the area and explained his plans for each part. His answers made her nod, but they also led to more questions. They talked for about 30 minutes before he suggested they go inside to prepare the dough for his Saturday bread. Instead of just helping him with the dough, she asked him many questions about the different ingredients. He noticed that many times these questions ended with why. Why did he need to use yeast? Why did he add sugar to the yeast? Why did he need baking powder and baking soda? Why did he add seeds? He had answers for many of these questions but struggled to respond to some others. He made hamburgers for dinner while they waited for Gwen to come over. Sherilyn opened her homework and started working on it. While doing this, she asked questions that often began with why. When Gwen arrived, Gerald was telling her that multiplication was like adding a number many times. To show this, he had dried beans laid out on the table to count them one by one, and showing how much faster it was to count them in equal rows. Gwen seemed to understand his explanation, if not fully agree. When Gwen got there, he stopped and put the burgers on the grill, which was hot and ready. Sherilyn kept working on her homework while Gwen helped him chop lettuce, tomatoes, and onions. After they finished eating and the two girls were getting ready to leave, Gerald called Sherilyn over to his shelf and showed her how the bread dough had doubled in size. He was ready with the answer to her why question when she asked it. She smiled for the first time since she got home and said a simple, "Thanks, Gerald," before giving him a friendly hug. After they left, as he was cleaning up, he realized that this change in Sherilyn might be her first step in trying to understand what was happening to her, her father, and her mother. She wasn't quite ready to understand complex whys yet, but she was beginning to learn about the world around her. For some reason he couldn't explain. It made him happy that he was the one she chose to start this journey with. The next afternoon, as he took the last loaves of bread out of the brick oven, he saw Sherilyn walking toward him again. "Gerald, Mom wants to know if you will come for dinner. She is making spaghetti, and it will be ready soon. Let me put these loaves on the cooling rack, then we can walk up there together. Gerald, I got a 100 on my math test today. Congratulations! That's great to hear. Every time I looked at a problem, I thought of the beans on the table like last night, and it all made sense. That's wonderful news to me, too. I would have felt bad if the beans didn't help you get the answers right." "Oh, Gerald, I don't think you can do anything wrong." He thought for a moment and then said, "Most of us don't do many things wrong, but sometimes, even when we do something right, it doesn't turn out the way we hoped. Come in and I'll show you." He led her into the cabin and over to his cooling rack. "See this loaf of bread? We made the dough last night, just like we always do. But this loaf didn't rise properly and turned out flat. We didn't make any mistakes, but it just didn't turn out like the others." "Why not?" "We followed the same steps, so it should have worked," I said. "It should have," he replied. "But sometimes things go wrong for reasons we don't expect. I think the loaf might have gotten too warm last night, and the yeast probably died before it could rise in the oven. On my rack, one loaf always sits at this end. The heater is on the other side of the wall, and that wall gets hot sometimes. That might be why this loaf is different. The taste will still be good. It just looks unusual. Oh, now let's check on your mom for dinner. I'm hungry, and she won't be happy if we're late." He grabbed a bottle of wine he had been saving and a loaf of warm Italian bread he baked in the brick oven. Together, they walked to Gwen's house and were welcomed with a warm smile. The following week, Gerald received 2 jobs for raised bed gardens, which he handled easily. As he was leaving the second house, the woman asked if he could remove a bush that had grown too big for her yard. It took him 20 minutes to dig it out and load it into his truck. Instead of taking it to the dump, he brought it home and planted it along his driveway. This led him to start creating non-food gardens that many people admired as they drove by. He spent the rest of the week working on his tractor and looking up information online, as well as continuing his work on the barn. The barn was a timber frame structure, which meant that the thick corner posts and beams created a strong base for the walls. He had enough beams for the framework, but he needed triangular rafters to support the roof. He also had about half the siding he needed to finish. When he checked the price of new rafters for the roof, he was disappointed. He went back online to see how he could make them himself, but the cost of materials was just as high as the pre-made ones. He hoped to find a better way. That chance came one day when he was leaving the metal recycler. He saw a truck carrying metal siding and several straight roof trusses often used for flat roofs on warehouses. He stopped and asked the driver where the metal was from. The driver explained that they were tearing down an old warehouse on the east side of town. Gerald drove over and spoke with the project supervisor. He learned that the entire building would be scrapped because there wasn't much demand for used building materials like those. Gerald offered to pay twice the salvage price for 15 of the trusses. After a phone call, Gerald bought 15 25-foot roof beams for $500. He had to rent a longer trailer to carry them, which took 3 trips, but he finally had the beams he needed for the roof. He just had to figure out how to use them since they were 5 feet longer than he needed. It didn't take long for him to decide to make the roof slanted. He just needed to add a bit more height on one side of the barn. Next, he had to find a way to lift the beams up 15 feet. A crane could have lifted them into place in one day, but renting a crane cost nearly $2,000 for a day. After some thought, he decided to use a boat winch on the tallest side of the barn and a wide board as a ramp to pull the beams up one by one. It took him 2 days, but he got all 15 beams in place and secured them firmly to the frame. A week later, the metal roof was safely attached to the beams, and he stepped back to admire his work. He was both surprised and pleased to see he had built the roof for only $500. When he showed Gwen and Sherilyn what he accomplished, they both praised him, and Gwen noted how the slope of the roof matched the hill around it perfectly. Gerald hadn't even noticed that until she said something. During this time, a few things changed. The most important was that Sherilyn started coming over to ask him about subjects she was learning at school. Almost every Friday, she proudly told him she had scored 100 on her tests. Overall, her grades were good, but she seemed especially happy about the perfect scores. Another change was that Gerald found himself worrying less about the future. He accepted that he could solve almost every problem he faced. In April, Gwen came to talk to him. "Gerald, they are moving Jim to a prison about 50 miles away. I can visit him once a month, but I'm not sure how Sherilyn will feel about visiting him every month. I wondered if she could stay with you every other month. That way I can take her in the months in between." "Gwen, you know I don't mind looking after Sherilyn. Just let me know when you need me and I'll make it work." "Thank you. I really appreciate it, and she seems to enjoy spending time with you. I guess you've noticed she's become quite the curious one. She asks me questions about everything." "No, I hadn't noticed. We've talked like we always did. Sometimes she would ask her dad questions, but not very often. Well, for some reason, she has been asking me about the barn, baking bread, and so many other things. Honestly, I like it as long as I know the answers." He grinned a little shyly. "Thank you for helping her. I know this has been tough for her. I was worried at first, but her teachers said she was doing well. They mentioned she has been improving a bit lately. That's good. I will help her whenever she needs me," he replied. Gwen looked at him closely for a moment and then said, "You are really special. I don't think you see that." Gerald didn't know how to answer. He felt a bit shy. That Saturday, Sherilyn went to the farmer's market with Gerald, while Gwen visited the prison. Sherilyn walked around for a bit and then returned to Gerald's table. He had sold about half of his bread. When a school friend came by with her parents, Sherilyn happily told her friend that she helped Gerald make the bread. Her friend thought that was great. Sherilyn explained how the yeast works and how it helps the bread rise. Everyone listened carefully and asked Gerald some questions about his recipe. They ended up buying 2 loaves of his bread. After they sold everything and packed up Gerald's truck, he took Sherilyn to a local restaurant where she ordered a hot dog and he chose a hamburger. When their food arrived, Sherilyn took the bun off her hot dog and ate it with a fork along with the toppings. "Why aren't you eating the bun, Cherie?" Gerald asked. "Since I started eating your bread, the bun just doesn't taste good anymore. Why don't you make hot dog and hamburger buns? They are just bread, right?" Sherilyn replied. Gerald stared at her, his mind racing with thoughts. Then he smiled and said, "Thank you." "For what?" "I didn't say anything important," Sherilyn responded. "You might be surprised by how meaningful what you said is. Gerald, we are starting to learn division in school and everyone says it's tough. Can you help me?" "Sure, let's go home and work with some beans." Division can be tricky at first, but once you get it like you did with multiplication, it becomes easy. They drove home, and when Gwen arrived, she saw them at the table with a bunch of beans. She laughed at the sight. She had picked up ingredients for a chicken Caesar salad and invited Gerald to join them for dinner. By then, Sherilyn was starting to understand how to divide the beans into different piles. Gerald accepted the dinner invitation but took out some frozen bread dough to let it thaw before leaving. After getting home, he spent the evening trying out different shapes with the dough and left them to rise. On Sunday morning, he heated his brick oven, and when it was ready, he baked 12 buns. Since these were smaller than a loaf of bread, he had to stay nearby to make sure they didn't bake too long. When he took them out, he was pleased to see that some of the buns looked great, while a few ended up looking like small loaves of bread. At noon, he called Gwen and invited them over for burgers and hot dogs for dinner. Gwen said yes, but she would bring some potato salad. When they got there, they saw Gerald by his grill, lost in thought. "What are you thinking about, Gerald?" Sherilyn asked. "I think I will change the hamburgers a bit before I cook them," he replied. "Why?" she asked. "Because you told me a lot of things yesterday." "No, I didn't. You told me a lot of things," she corrected him. He smiled and said, "You might be surprised, little one." Gwen looked confused by their talk. She went inside and put the potato salad in the fridge after Gerald took the platter with the burgers and hot dogs outside. He gently changed their shape, and soon they were sizzling on the grill. Gwen set the table and poured tea for everyone. Sherilyn helped her mother. When Gerald brought in the steaming platter, both girls looked at it with raised eyebrows. Their surprise quickly turned to delight when he placed the plate of buns on the table. The buns were oval-shaped, longer than a regular hamburger bun, but wider than a hot dog bun. The burgers were also oval. Sherilyn squealed happily as she piled a bun with a hot dog, lots of relish and other toppings. Gwen took a bun, added an oval burger, and topped it with lettuce, tomatoes, onions, and ketchup. She was amazed that the bun held everything without spilling. It was easy to hold and didn't fall apart like many store-bought buns. The burger tasted just right, although the bun was a bit sweeter and had a different texture. They enjoyed their meal, laughing at the funny shapes of the burgers and buns. "Okay, Mr. Chef, can you explain this? They're really good," Gwen asked. Gerald said, "It's all Sherilyn's fault." "Me? I didn't do anything," she replied. "Yes, you did. You said yesterday that a hot dog bun didn't taste good anymore and that I should make buns like my bread. Well, that's what you just ate. Last night I tried different ways to make the buns and let them rise. This morning I baked them. I liked these buns the best, but a round hamburger wouldn't stay in them very well, so I made them the same shape as the bun. So, it's all your fault. I'm going to call them Sherry buns." Sherilyn squealed with joy. Gwen looked at her daughter and Gerald, smiling widely. "By the way, Sherry, what did I do after I baked the buns?" Gerald asked. She thought for a moment before she carefully said, "Well, you let them cool, and then you cut them in half. I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. You just said it." She looked puzzled. "What did I say?" "I cut the bun in half. What's another way to say that?" She thought and then replied, "You divided the bun into 2 parts." "Exactly. You do division every day and never think about it." Her eyes lit up and she said, "I guess I do, don't I?" "Hey, that's pretty neat. Division isn't as tough as they said it would be." "Exactly. I told you it's easy once you get it. You really seem to understand now." Sherilyn smiled proudly. Gwen asked, "So is this a cooking lesson or a math lesson?" Gerald answered, "Both, I guess." Then Gwen said, "I was thinking, these buns could be like the ones you made, but they could also be dinner rolls or sandwich rolls or lots of other kinds. You should try selling some at the market and see what people think. They really taste better than regular rolls or buns." "Thanks. I thought about that, but now that you've tried them, I'll keep working on them and see what I can come up with." On Monday morning, he tried different ways to make the buns and let them rise while he worked in his garden. He also visited Gwen's garden, pulled weeds for a bit, and then went home to heat up the brick oven. An hour later, a dozen buns made with different methods were cooling on the rack. One looked better than the rest. For that one, he had rolled the dough like a pie crust, cut it into a circle, rolled it like a wrap, and pinched the ends. It turned out light, but strong enough to hold together. He decided to make a couple dozen more to try selling at the market on Saturday. After that, he sat down to work on his tax return. He quickly got lost in all the details and thought he might owe over $5,000, which made him worry about money. So he called one of his bread customers and set up a meeting to go over everything. When he left his meeting, he felt a huge weight lifted off his shoulders. He owed nothing. He hadn't counted his expenses right. The accountant also suggested he build a separate kitchen for baking and set up a sales tax exemption to buy materials at lower prices. He even gave him a spreadsheet program to track his baking, recycling work, and farming. He never realized that he was really running 3 different businesses. By keeping better records, the accountant thought he would not have to pay taxes for a few more years, and even then, there were ways to lower that amount. Gerald went home, installed the spreadsheet, and entered all his expenses for the year. He was surprised to see he had made as much money this year as last year before expenses. After expenses, he had less income on paper, but he had more money in the bank and felt much more secure than before. The idea of a separate kitchen stayed in his mind for a few weeks and became a solid plan 2 weeks later. He took 30 of his buns to the market on Saturday. He sold about half and gave away the rest as samples. The next week, he had orders for almost 200 buns. It was the season for grilling, and people wanted his buns for their cookouts. The following week, he needed to start making dough on Wednesday. He needed both Thursday and Friday to bake everything in his kitchen oven and his brick oven. While he waited for a load in the brick oven to finish, he looked around his home. Instead of just the kitchen, he imagined a whole new space with a new kitchen and bedroom. The current rooms would become a dining room and living room. He felt he had enough supplies for most of it and thought he could add some extra baking tools to the kitchen. The more he thought about it, the more he liked the idea. Later, he sat down with his notes and decided to charge $4 for 6 buns. He wondered if people would pay that. So he created a price plan where people could buy 1, 2, 3, or 4 buns, and then buy larger amounts. He thought this would be better since many of his customers were single or couples. On Wednesday night, Sherilyn came over to help him roll out the dough for Thursday's baking, and returned to help him again on Thursday. Gwen had a meeting one night and a school event the next. Gerald made a light dinner for her each night, which she really appreciated after her busy days. She promised to make dinner for them on Friday night. On Saturday, he went to the farmer's market and sold everything he brought. On his way home, he stopped at Gwen's house and gave Sherilyn $40 for her help. Gwen tried to argue, but Gerald didn't listen. He explained that Sherilyn had worked for 2 hours each night while he prepared his dough and had saved him a lot of time. She earned it, and he insisted she take it. Finally, Gwen agreed. Just before noon on Sunday, Gwen and Sherilyn walked over to find him sitting on his small porch drinking tea. "And to what do I owe the pleasure of your company this lovely morning? Would you like a glass of tea?" he asked. They agreed, and once they were all seated, Gwen said, "Go on, Sherry, ask him." "Gerald, Mommy said I could keep the money if I saved half of it. The other half I could spend on things I want," Sherilyn said. "I think that's a great idea, and you will be glad you did, Cherie. So, what do you want to buy with your spending money?" "I'm going to buy dinner tonight for you and Mommy at the Mexican restaurant," she said proudly. Gerald looked at Gwen, who smiled back at him and nodded her head slightly. "I accept your generous offer. We will celebrate this evening, but let's make it special. Save some of your money for yourself in the future. You earned it." "Are you okay?" Sherilyn smiled and replied, "I'm good." Then she went inside. Gwen stayed and watched Gerald. "You wouldn't believe how happy she is to earn some money, and now she can spend a little on herself. I try to get her what she needs, but sometimes I can't get her what she wants. Still, she really wanted to take us out to dinner tonight. I'm not sure she has enough to cover 3 dinners, but I can make up the difference." "Only if I don't handle it first," he said with a smile, and she smiled back. Sherilyn returned and announced that she needed to go home and get ready for her evening plans. Gwen and Gerald both chuckled at this. They agreed to meet at their house at 6 o'clock. Gwen drove them to Sherilyn's favorite Mexican restaurant. It was part of a chain but had good meals. Gerald and Gwen quickly realized that the bill would be closer to $30 than $20. Gwen looked at Gerald. He nodded, and after they ordered, he said he was heading to the restroom. Gwen saw him pause at the hostess's station and talk to her for a moment. He pointed to their table and handed her something. She smiled and nodded. Sherilyn ordered tacos, which she loved, while Gwen and Gerald both got enchiladas. After they finished, Gwen suggested getting ice cream, which everyone liked. When the waitress brought the check, Gerald nodded toward Sherilyn. The waitress smiled and placed it in front of her. Sherilyn looked at the bill and smiled with pride. She walked to the counter and paid $15 for their dinner. Gwen and Gerald hugged her, thanking her for the meal, and she beamed as they headed out to the car. For the next few weeks, Gerald mostly focused on baking bread. He kept up with his garden tasks, but had to turn down 2 good jobs involving cleaning barns. One day, 2 local hamburger restaurants approached him at the market about making buns for them. He said he would think about it and get back to them. That night, he realized he had a choice: make buns for the restaurants or for the market. He would earn about the same amount of money in either case, but baking for the restaurants would mean losing touch with the people at the market. He decided to pass on the restaurant offer and planned to call them after this week's market. Before he got the chance, a man approached him at the next market. The man introduced himself as the sales manager for a regional bakery. When Gerald packed up, they met at a local coffee shop. The man started with, "I'm Bill Medwick, the sales manager at Sun States Baking. I was talking to the 2 hamburger restaurants who are our customers. They mentioned that you have been baking a new kind of bun and selling it to locals. The locals have started asking for a burger on a special sherry bun, but the shop doesn't have it. They brought me a few of the buns, and I must say you've created something unique. They taste great and can be used for many things, not just burgers." "Thank you. I call these the CHERI buns, named after a young friend who inspired me to make a delicious bun," I said. That's wonderful. We want to talk to you about buying the rights to your bun so we can make and sell it in our area. Are you interested? Gerald felt like saying yes right away, but he had just taken a sip of coffee and couldn't speak. Once he could talk again, he said, I might be. What do you have in mind? I can offer you $25,000 for the recipe and the rights to use the name Sherry Buns. Gerald wanted to agree immediately, but he paused and replied, That sounds generous. Let me talk to my accountant and business advisor on Monday morning, and I'll call you in the afternoon. It's about taxes and such. I understand. Here's my card. I'll wait for your call. It was nice talking to you. They shook hands and went their separate ways. Gerald felt on top of the world. He wanted to rush home and share the good news with Gwen and Sherilyn, but he remembered they were visiting the prison for the weekend. He figured they might not want to hear his news tonight, so he decided to wait until the next day. Instead, he called the accountant and left a message asking for a short meeting on Monday morning. Just before he got home, the accountant returned his call, asking if he could meet on Sunday after lunch since he would be busy with meetings on Monday and Tuesday. Gerald agreed. Leaving the accountant's office, Gerald had a lot to think about. As he drove home, he planned his next steps. First, he wanted to offer the baking company the rights to make the bun for 10 years, charging a royalty of 1 cent for each bun sold. This way, they wouldn't need to pay a large sum up front, and if sales weren't great, they wouldn't lose much. But if the buns sold well, Gerald would earn more than the $25,000 they offered. This way, both parties would share the risk. Second, Gerald wanted to include Sherilyn in the earnings because she inspired the name. The accountant suggested deciding what percentage to give her and setting it up so it goes into a college fund. Since Sherilyn was young, neither he nor Gwen would need to pay taxes on it, and it would be there for her when she finished high school. She might have to pay some taxes then, but it would be a small amount. Gerald found both suggestions valuable, but he decided to ask for one more thing that he hoped wouldn't be a deal-breaker. He wanted to keep the right to sell up to 200 buns each week at the market. He had many customers, especially older ones who didn't buy packs of 6 or 8. They preferred to buy just 2 or 3, and he wanted to keep helping them. He felt good when he got home and felt even better when he saw a note on his door inviting him to dinner at 6 o'clock. It was spaghetti night. Luckily, he had dough in the fridge for fresh bread and a new bottle of wine in the pantry. They had a lovely dinner, but Gerald stayed quiet and listened to the friendly chatter between mother and daughter. Finally, Gwen turned to him and said, You're really quiet. Something must have happened while we were gone. Want to share? He smiled. I think it's pretty good. I hope you think so too. I'm going to sell the rights to my bun recipe. A bakery wants to buy it and sell the buns all over the area. That's great, Gerald. I'm proud of you. Does this mean we won't be making buns anymore? Sherilyn asked, sounding sad. No, Sherry, it doesn't mean that. I'm keeping the right to make buns for the market. So I can still help you make them? Of course. You are my baking buddy. But there's more. Gwen, do you think the buns will be successful? I can't see why they wouldn't be. Why do you ask? They offered me a lump sum of money. I spoke to the accountant today. He suggested I ask for a small royalty for every bun sold for 10 years. If the sales go well, I could earn more than their offer. If not, I just won't make as much. Then I believe you'll make more than they offered. Are you happy? I am. I just hope you will be too. Why would I be? Because I've decided to give a third of the royalties to Sherilyn. She inspired me, and they will be using her name. The money will go into a college fund for her, and she'll get it when she finishes high school. This way, we won't have to worry about taxes, and when she's done with school, the tax will be very small. He looked at Gwen and saw tears rolling down her cheeks. Then he glanced at Sherilyn, who looked shocked, as if she didn't fully understand what he said. He waited quietly until Gwen gathered her emotions. Gerald, you don't have to do this. Yes, I do. It's the right thing. Gwen looked at Sherilyn and then back at Gerald. We started a college fund for her, but I'm embarrassed to say how little is in it, and I don't expect it to grow much. I've been encouraging her to do well in school so she might get a scholarship. Gerald, what is a scholarship? It's something a student gets when they show they're good at school, then it helps pay for college. Don't worry, Mom, I will get a scholarship. I know you will, honey. Just do your best. Gwen wiped the tears from her eyes and turned to Gerald. Thank you, Gerald. You can't imagine how I feel right now. I think I can guess, and I feel the same way. On Monday, Gerald called Bill Medwick at 9 o'clock in the morning. Medwick was surprised to hear from him so early, but felt happy when Gerald mentioned he had a different offer. The sales manager was even happier when he heard what the offer included. After Gerald finished, Medwick said he would call back within an hour. Just as Gerald expected, Medwick called back quickly and accepted his offer. He mentioned that the papers would be ready by the end of the week. They planned to meet and sign the papers, and Gerald could share his recipe then. Gerald invited him to come on Thursday because he would be making dough and buns for the Saturday market. Medwick said he would try to come and would let Gerald know. After hanging up, Gerald went out to install 4 gardens. He was gone for most of the day, but he felt good about how things were going when he got home. Gwen had decided to teach summer school to earn some extra money. Gerald made sure Sherilyn would stay with him while Gwen worked. Gwen didn't argue, especially when Sherilyn looked at her and said, "Please." Sherilyn arrived in the morning after breakfast. Gerald changed his schedule to do gardening and dough making in the mornings. Gwen got home around 2 o'clock. If he had any cleaning to do, he tried to fit it in during the afternoon. As they worked and spent time together, Gerald talked to Sherilyn about many topics. She asked a lot of questions. By the end of the summer, she had learned about plants, chemistry, biology, math, reading, and writing. Each day, Gerald asked her to write about what they did. By the time summer school finished, Sherilyn was writing detailed and bright descriptions of her days. Gerald also paid her for helping with the gardens and the bread. When summer school ended, Gwen and Sherilyn went to visit Gwen's parents for a week. That week felt very long for Gerald, even though he stayed busy. He made a special dinner for them when they returned, feeling like life was back to normal. As work slowed down in the fall, Gerald started to build an addition onto the house. He got the frame, outside, and roof finished before the fall rains began. He was surprised at how quickly he finished the inside, partly because the new kitchen was next to the old one, and he could use the existing plumbing easily. They celebrated Thanksgiving at Gwen's house, but Gerald insisted on having Christmas dinner in his newly remodeled dining room. Gerald bought Gwen and Sherilyn nice Christmas gifts, and in return, they each gave him a present. At Christmas dinner, he happily handed Sherilyn her first money check from their bakery. They had started selling special buns in October, and the first check was for $750. He gave Sherilyn a share of $250. Both Sherilyn and Gwen were thrilled and couldn't wait for the bank to open the next day to put the money in Sherilyn's college account. During the week between Christmas and New Year's, Gerald worked hard to finish a new room in his house. They had a special housewarming party on New Year's Eve, and they lit the first fire in his stone fireplace. Years 2 and 3, the second year, flew by quickly. Gerald planted seeds early for their gardens. To make sure nothing went to waste, he used all the seeds in a packet and ended up with twice as many plants as he needed. He took care of them and brought them to the market on March 1st. Every plant sold fast. The next week, he planted packets of tomatoes and peppers. In total, he had over 500 plants of different kinds. He sold half of them in April for 50 cents each and the rest in May, when they grew bigger for $1 each. After that, he looked at plans for a greenhouse. He wanted to plant seeds in winter and sell them in spring. He noticed which types of plants the garden center sold, and he added some of those to his list, along with some others that were known to taste great in his area. As spring turned to summer, he collected used windows to build the greenhouse he wanted. Sherilyn kept coming over to help him with baking bread. They created a system that let them make more loaves in the same time. He kept his buns to about 200, but made more regular loaves. On April 1st, he received their second royalty check. This time, he put $3,000 in his bank account and $1,500 in Sherilyn's account. Gwen was amazed by the success of the buns. During the summer, Gerald and Sherilyn focused on building the greenhouse while Gwen taught summer school again. She asked many questions, and Gerald often sat down with paper and pencil to explain answers and different choices he could make. She found his practical way of teaching easier to understand than the more complicated methods at school. Her grades had improved a lot over the past year, and her reading, writing, math, and science teachers praised her. Fall was busy again, and they shared Thanksgiving and the Christmas and New Year's holidays like before. Christmas was happy once more because the royalty check was the largest they had received yet. The two earlier events were similar to the first one, but the last one added $6,000 to his account and $3,000 to hers. The third year began well, but in February, he got a call from Gwen in the middle of the day. "Gerald, I just received a call from the prison. Something has happened, and I need to find out what. They wouldn't tell me on the phone. Can you look after Sherilyn for a couple of days? I don't know how long I'll be away." "Of course. Go take care of things there. I will manage here." He could hear her relax a bit. "I knew I could count on you, but I hate taking you for granted. You already do so much for us." "Hey, you do more for us than I can say. Now go. Everything will be fine here." That afternoon, he drove to school to pick up Sherilyn instead of waiting for the bus. She was happy to see him and jumped into his truck. Before leaving the school, he explained what was happening. Her face looked sad, but she didn't cry. She just nodded and stayed quiet until they got home. Once they arrived, she grabbed a change of clothes and they went to Gerald's house. She got changed while he made tea for both of them. After that, they sat on the porch. "Gerald, I know my daddy loves me and my mom, but he does things that hurt us. Why does that happen?" "Sherry, I don't think anyone can give you a simple answer. Sometimes people think they are doing the right thing, but it doesn't turn out the way they hoped. That can hurt others. Other times, they get angry and do things that impact many people. Sometimes they just get frustrated and take it out on those closest to them. I don't know your dad, so I can't say what he thinks, but maybe he feels upset because he can't be with you and your mom, and that makes him act in ways that are hard for everyone. You don't do things like that. I can't picture you ever hurting someone. Sometimes people hurt each other without intending to. Is there someone at school you feel uneasy around?" "Yes, there's one girl who makes me feel uncomfortable." "Has she ever done anything to hurt you?" "No, I don't know why, but there's just something about her." "Well, you could say she is affecting you by making you uncomfortable without actually doing anything." She thought for a moment before answering, "I guess I understand that." There might be another side to this, too. "What do you mean? Have you ever considered if you might also affect her?" "No, never. I don't think we've even talked. Have you thought that she could be feeling unsure about you, too, and doesn't want to approach you?" "But I don't know how." That's one of the curious things about people. Sometimes you might feel uneasy for no clear reason and behave differently without knowing why. Maybe you should try talking to her someday. You could find out that she's not like you thought. Sherilyn didn't answer, but Gerald noticed she was thinking. He suggested they go into town for Mexican food. Her mood lifted and she agreed. They made some bread dough and set it on the shelf to rise. After washing up, they drove into town for dinner. When they finished eating and were waiting for the check, a woman walked over and introduced herself to Gerald. She mentioned that she had been buying some of his buns at the market, and her family really enjoyed them. She wanted to know how he made the burgers that went in them. He told her to sit down, and he would explain. Sherilyn looked around and noticed a girl sitting alone watching the woman chat with Gerald. "Gerald, excuse me for a minute. I'll be right back," she said. Gerald nodded and started to explain how he made his oval burgers. The conversation flowed, and 20 minutes passed quickly. When the talk slowed down, he looked up to see Sherilyn standing next to their table with a shy-looking girl beside her. When Gerald saw them, Sherilyn introduced the girl. "Gerald, this is the girl we were talking about earlier. Her name is Jennifer, but everyone calls her Jenny. She needs help understanding fractions. Can she come home with me tomorrow so you can help us both?" Gerald smiled and replied, "That's fine with me, but you should check with her mom first." Jennifer looked at the woman sitting next to Gerald and asked, "Mom, can I go with Sherry tomorrow to get some help with math?" The woman glanced at her daughter and then at Gerald. "I suppose that's okay as long as you're fine with it. I'm not much help with math, and her dad is too busy with work to help right now." "Of course I would be happy to help. Would you like me to bring her home when we're done?" Gerald offered. "Actually, I have a meeting too. I can pick her up around 7 o'clock if you give me your address," the woman replied. "Why don't I make sure she has dinner too? That way you won't have to hurry," Gerald suggested. She looked surprised and said, "I would really appreciate that. Is that okay with you, Jenny?" "Yes, ma'am. I would like that a lot," Jenny replied. Gerald said, "I'll pick you both up after school." They both smiled and returned to the other table. Jennifer's mom continued, "You have a lovely daughter, Gerald. Jenny is a bit shy and doesn't have many friends at school. I'm happy to see that she and Sherilyn get along so well. Thank you, but she's not my daughter. I live next door to her and her mom, Gwen Lambert," Gerald explained. "The teacher? I met her at the PTA meeting. I really like her," the woman said. "Did you hear? She had an emergency with her husband or something like that." Gerald sensed that she wanted to know more, so he replied carefully, "Yes, she had a family emergency, but I don't know the details. I just offered to look after Sherilyn while she's away. She must really trust you to leave her daughter with you." Gerald noticed again that she was trying to get more information. "Well, we're neighbors, and we've shared meals before. I've helped Sherilyn with her homework a bit, so I think she trusts me enough." He hoped that would stop any rumors, but he worried it might not be enough. "It's nice to have a neighbor like you. We should get going now. I'll make sure Jenny gets picked up before 7 o'clock. "It was great talking to you. I'll take good care of Jennifer while she's here." The woman stood up and walked back to her table to gather her things. Sherilyn returned to Gerald, smiling widely. Once in the truck, he asked her, "Do you want to tell me about it?" Sherilyn could hardly contain her excitement. "I thought about what you said, and I decided to go talk to her. We haven't been in the same class, so we didn't really know each other. She was surprised, but happy I came over. She's a bit shy like me. She does well in all her subjects, except math. When she said she was having trouble with fractions, I told her how much you helped me. She asked if you could help her too. I said you would. She was also happy when I mentioned you made the sherry buns. Can we have those for dinner tomorrow? Her mom can't make burgers like you do. We can do math after school and then grill the burgers. Does that sound good?" Gerald laughed at how excited she sounded. "So you're not scared of her anymore?" "Oh no, she's just quiet like me. She said she was a little worried because I do well in math and she was struggling. Usually she gets her dad to help, but he's been busy running for sheriff." "Gerald, what's a sheriff?" Gerald explained that a sheriff is an elected leader, sort of like the head of the police for the whole county, not just the city. She understood, and they drove home quietly. After finishing her homework, she got ready for bed, but Gerald could tell she was excited about making a new friend and couldn't wait for the next day. The next day, Gerald baked a fresh batch of sherry buns and picked up the girls from school on time. They chatted non-stop in the truck from the time they left school until he parked in front of their house. Sherilyn took Jennifer's hand and led her to see the brick oven and the garden. Then they went inside, where Gerald had made fresh tea and had beans spread all over the table. For the next 2 hours, they worked together to sort stacks of beans into equal parts. Slowly, Gerald noticed a look of understanding growing in Jennifer's eyes. They moved on to adding and subtracting fractions. With their new knowledge, the rules of fractions became easy for them. While they got started on their homework, Gerald went outside to prepare the grill. Just as the grill was heating up for the burgers, Gerald heard a car drive up his driveway. He hoped it was Gwen, but then he saw a different car pull in behind his truck. A well-dressed man stepped out. Jennifer recognized the car and raced outside to greet her father. She held his hand and brought him over to Gerald to introduce them. "Gerald, this is my daddy. He's running for sheriff," Jennifer said proudly. "Daddy, this is Gerald. He helped me understand fractions today. I can do them now. And this is Sherilyn from next door. She is my new friend." Her excitement was clear. Gerald shook hands with the man, who said, "Hi, I think my daughter might have forgotten to say my name is Jim Sanders. Nice to meet you, Jim. I'm Gerald Murphy." "Oh, you're the one I've heard about. You do gardens and make bread, right?" "Yes, that's me. I hope what you heard was good." "Well, if it were any better, someone would want to give you an award. I was about to cook some burgers on the grill. Would you like to join us?" "I'd love to if it's no trouble. I haven't had anything since breakfast, and I'm tired of the diner. If I win, I'll have to find better places to eat. I don't want to end up like a cartoon sheriff." "I get that. No problem at all. Sherilyn, could you get a couple more burgers from the fridge? And if you two are done with your homework, you can set the table." "We finished." They ran inside to do what he asked. "So, Jim, I take it that your wife was concerned about you checking in on a single guy with your daughter?" Jim smiled and replied, "You've got it right." She was happy that Jenny found a friend, but when she heard that Sherilyn was staying here while her mom was away, she had a few reservations. Pam watches a lot of crime shows, and I think she tends to be cautious. You had no trouble, I hope. None at all. I guess with so many uncertainties out there, it's good to be careful. We worked on fractions, and they did their homework just fine. They're both great kids. Jenny is a good girl, but a little shy. It's nice to see her so happy about you and Sherilyn. Honestly, I didn't expect running for office to take so much of my time. I miss helping Jenny with her homework. She finds math a bit challenging. I'm glad you're assisting her. No trouble at all for me. They chatted a bit longer while the burgers were cooking. Gerald invited Jim inside, and they saw the table ready with the girls talking happily at it. Gerald set the platter down on the table and served up a big bowl of beans he had made, along with baked potato wedges. There was more than enough for everyone. They sat down, filled their plates, and then Gerald heard another car coming up the driveway. This time he recognized Gwen's car. "Sherry, I think your mom is back. Why don't you go greet her and bring her in? We have lots for her, too." Sherilyn jumped up and ran outside to meet her mom with a big hug and pulled her inside. When Gwen came in, Gerald noticed she looked a bit tired, but she smiled warmly as Sherilyn introduced her to Jennifer and her father. Jim stood and shook hands with her. Everyone was pleasantly surprised when Jennifer said, "Hello, Miss Lambert. I've missed you this year. You are the best teacher I have ever had." "Hello, Jennifer, and thank you for the kind words. You were one of my best students. How is school going for you this year?" "Pretty good, especially after Gerald helped me with math today." Gwen gave Gerald a grateful smile and said, "So your student load has doubled?" Gerald felt himself blush. Sherilyn looked at Jennifer and added, "They won't let me be in Mom's class. I think they worry I might not take it seriously." The adults laughed, and Gerald pulled up a chair for Sherilyn between the two girls. "Thanks, Gerald. I'm so hungry I didn't feel like eating at all today." Jim said, "Try these beans. They're amazing. The potato wedges are good, too. Where did you get these beans, Gerald? I want to find some for home. I actually made them myself. I grew these beans and have been experimenting with different spices to find the best one. Well, I really like this recipe. If you decide to share them, I'll be sure to get some for myself." Everyone settled in to eat, and Gerald noticed that some of the tiredness faded from Gwen's face. The girls kept chatting away, and he mostly listened to their conversation, enjoying the light-hearted exchanges. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Jim's phone rang. "Oops, my better half wants to know where we are. Excuse me, hello? Yes, everything is all right. No, we're just finishing dinner. We'll be home in 30 minutes. Gwen Lambert just got back and we were getting to know each other. Yes, Jenny seems very proud that she understands fractions now." There was a pause, and then he replied, "I'll think about it, but I'm not sure it's a good idea." "We'll be home soon, and we can talk about it," he said, hanging up the phone. He then said, "We've been married for 10 years, and she still feels the need to check up on me." Silence fell over the table, except for the girls, who continued their lively conversation, seemingly unfazed by his comment. Jim finally got up and informed Jennifer it was time to go. He shook hands with both Gwen and Gerald, wishing them good night. Jennifer expressed her eagerness to see Sherilyn at school the next day. Sherilyn echoed her sentiments, and they shared a warm hug before Jennifer left with her dad. Sherilyn held her mom's hand as they watched the car drive away. Once they were gone, Gwen turned to Sherilyn and said, "Sherry, I need to talk to Gerald for a bit. Can you go inside and use the computer while I chat with him?" "Sure, Mom." Then her expression darkened as she asked, "Is Daddy okay?" "Yes, dear. He was hurt, but he will be fine." "Okay." Jennifer talks a lot about her dad, but I didn't want to tell her about mine. Sherilyn went inside, and Gerald moved one rocking chair next to another and sat down. Gwen joined him. "I'm not ready to talk just yet, Gerald. Can you tell me about Sherry and her new friend?" Gerald shared what he knew about their conversation and dinner from the night before, explaining how Sherilyn talked to Jennifer and set up the meeting for the day. Gwen just nodded, a smile on her face. "Now I want to talk too," Gerald said. "When I spoke with Jennifer's mom last night, it seemed like she was trying to find out about your emergency trip. I tried to downplay it, but I don't think I did a great job. And when I said that Sherry was your daughter, not mine, I think she got the idea that there might be something else going on between us. I tried to deny it, but you might hear some rumors. Gwen looked at him and nodded. It's okay. I hear similar things. I met Jenny's mom at the PTA and I felt the same way you did. But I like Jim. He seems like a good guy, just like you. Yes, I feel the same. All right, now it's my turn. She took a deep breath and continued. When I got to the prison, I learned he was in the hospital after a serious incident. It turns out he got involved with one of those groups, and there was a conflict with others. He was injured, but the worst part is that he caused harm to someone. He will now face manslaughter charges, which means he could get another 10 to 15 years added to his sentence. When I talked to him in the hospital, he apologized and asked me not to tell Sherry about his injury. Gerald, he told me I should get a divorce and move on with my life. He knows he messed up again and that it will take a long time before he gets out. I went to the motel and cried all night and all morning until I felt strong enough to drive home. What should I do, Gerald? I didn't marry him to leave when things got tough, but this is almost too much. He has all these tattoos that show he supports hate now, and even if he gets out soon, I don't want Sherry around him if he stays with those kinds of people. I'm scared and confused. Please help me understand. Tears came back to her eyes as she finished. Gerald thought for a few minutes before he replied, Gwen, I've never faced something like this, and I'm not sure what to say to make you feel better. But I want you to know that it's okay to feel scared, confused, and worried about Sherilyn's future. I don't think there is an easy answer, so I think you don't need to make a decision right now. You have your house and your job, and you're doing okay. Give yourself some time to think this through. You'll need to talk to Sherilyn about it when you feel ready. When that time comes, I believe you'll know what to do for both of you. I wanted you to tell me exactly what to do and make it simple, but I think what you just said is the best for me right now. I'm so confused that I might make a quick choice that isn't right. Your words are comforting and understanding. Thank you, Gerald. You are the best friend a confused woman could have. I hope to be a good friend for you and Sherilyn. Whenever you want to talk, I'm here to listen. She reached out and touched his cheek gently. I knew that, but it helps to hear you say it. Her tears had stopped, and she gave a weak smile. Why don't you and Sherilyn go home when you're ready and enjoy a nice evening together? Tomorrow, come over here for dinner and we can share a simple, quiet time. I think that sounds good. Give me a few minutes to pull myself together and I'll take her home. Gerald nodded and went inside, leaving her with her thoughts. Sherilyn looked up at Gerald and smiled. She seemed like she wanted to say something, but she held back. 20 minutes later, Gwen came in and went straight to the bathroom. Gerald heard water running in the sink, so he guessed she was washing her face. When she returned, she looked calmer and more relaxed. Sherry, sweetheart, are you ready to go? We have school tomorrow and we're making dinner for Gerald tomorrow night. Okay, Mama. Can we make enchiladas and tacos again? We could, or we could make homemade pizzas if you want, Gwen answered. Let me think about it and we'll decide in the morning. Then we can surprise Gerald. I like that idea too. Sherilyn packed her things and Gerald walked them to their car and said goodnight. When he went back inside, he suddenly wished he had a TV. His mind was racing with many thoughts, and some light entertainment would have been nice. Instead, he picked up a new book he had bought and began to read. He finally went to bed after midnight and slept until 8 o'clock the next morning. Instead of making breakfast like he usually did, he decided to go into town to eat and pick up some supplies from the hardware store. He stopped at a local cafe and ordered a simple breakfast, just like what he usually had at home. While waiting for his meal, he heard a voice from behind him. Gerald, is that you? He turned to see Jim Sanders sitting at a table behind him. Jim got up and came over to Gerald's table. I want to thank you again for dinner last night and what you did for Jenny. She talked all the way home about how you helped her with the fractions using beans. You're welcome, Gerald said. After a moment, he added, Do you have a minute? Jim checked his watch and said, Sure. Let me grab another cup of coffee. He called the waitress to refill both their cups. Once they were alone, Jim asked, What's on your mind? Gerald took a breath and replied, There are a couple of things I want to clear up, and it's a bit awkward. First, I think there may be rumors about Gwen and me. I want you to know we are just neighbors and friends, nothing more. I like Sherilyn, and I think she likes me too, but there's no reason for rumors. I'm not worried about myself, but I don't want either Gwen or Sherilyn to face any gossip. Gwen is married, and Sherilyn really misses her dad. I'm only a friend. Jim looked at him with respect. I understand, and I'll do my best to keep things quiet if I hear anything. There's one more thing that's not really my business, but I think you're smart enough to handle it. Gwen's husband is in prison. I won't go into details, but there may be rumors about that as well. I really hope people will judge Gwen and Sherilyn for who they are and not based on someone they don't even know. Jim paused and looked into Gerald's eyes. I appreciate your honesty. You're talking about Pam, and we had a similar chat last night after Jenny went to bed. She thinks something unusual is happening but isn't sure what it is. I reminded her that we both grew up with the expectations of our father's jobs. She understood. But then I asked her to think about what would happen if I were elected sheriff. I knew that sooner or later I would have to talk to the mother, father, or brother of one of the kids at Jenny's school. I asked Jenny if she wanted to be ignored because I had to arrest someone's family member. She hadn't thought about that, so we talked for a long time about how this affects families. I can't say what will happen, but I think Jenny learned something important. I won't stop her from hanging out with Sherilyn, and I felt a lot of respect for Gwen after meeting her last night. I doubt that will change your worries, but I believe we understand each other. Thank you, Jim. You really get what I'm worried about. You just earned my vote. We need good people like you in office. Thanks. I should get going. I have another meeting to attend. He stood up, and Gerald stood too. They shook hands. Gerald gathered his things and went home, feeling like the weight on his shoulders had lifted a bit. That night he went to Gwen's house feeling better than he had for a week. They decided to have taco pizzas, mixing Italian and Mexican food, and had a great time. When Sherilyn went to her room for a bit, Gwen looked at Gerald and nervously said, Gerald, Jenny's mom came by the school today and invited us to dinner at their house tomorrow night. I told her I would check with you first. Gerald replied, I think I will skip it. It's more important for you and Sherry to build your friendship. You both should get to know each other better. Just tell them I have an important project to finish. Gerald, did you talk to one of them? I had a quick chat with Jim this morning. He mentioned that he and his wife talked after he got home last night. Gwen looked at him and understood his thoughts. Thank you, and I see what you're saying. I just don't want you to feel excluded. I won't feel excluded. It's really important that Jennifer and Sherry strengthen their new bond and that Pam and Jim get to know you. I promise I will join next time. I'm going to hold you to that. Deal. Gwen picked up her phone and made the call. Gerald heard her tell Pam that they would be happy to join for dinner, but Gerald had some work to finish. They set a time and said goodbye. Gerald smiled at her as she ended the call. She smiled back, although a bit shyly. Even though he would have liked to know Jenny's parents better, especially Jim, he went to sleep that night feeling like he made the right choice. A week later, Gwen invited the Sanders family to her house for dinner. Gerald kept his word and happily went, bringing 2 loaves of fresh Italian bread and the specific beans Jim had asked for. As soon as he walked into the house and said hello, Jennifer and Sherilyn grabbed his hand and pulled him into the living room. On the coffee table, beans were already laid out. He felt someone put a glass of tea next to him, and Sherilyn simply said, multiply fractions. Okay, here's a whole pile. One of you make 2 half piles. Jennifer quickly split the pile into 2. Now, Sherry, you make these into quarter piles. Sherilyn took a moment and divided the half pile into 4 equal parts. What you did was turn 1 pile into 2, and then one of those 2 into 4 smaller piles. Do you understand? They both nodded. So you made 1/4 of 1/2, right? They nodded again. And when you hear the word of, what do you think? They both answered at the same time, multiply. That's right, so how much does each of these small piles represent of the original pile? They thought for a second, and Sherilyn spoke first. 1/4. Jennifer quickly said, no, Sherry. That is 1/4 of 1/2. I think it's 1/8. She looked at Gerald for approval. He stayed quiet. Then Sherilyn's face lit up, and she said, I get it. Each of these is 1/4 of the half, but if we split the other half into pieces, we get 8 piles. So 1 pile is 1/8 of the whole pile. Jennifer smiled big along with Sherilyn. You two just won the jackpot and get to keep all the beans, Gerald said, and they both giggled. So for your homework and for the rest of your lives, every time you need to multiply fractions, you write the fractions down. Then you multiply the top number times the top number, and the bottom number times the bottom number like this. Jennifer asked, "Do we need to change the bottom numbers to be the same, like when we add or subtract?" No, you only do that for addition and subtraction. That's to make sure you're adding or subtracting the same kind of things. When you multiply or divide, you don't worry about them being the same because you're multiplying a set of similar things by a different number. Now, here are a couple of problems for both of you. He quickly wrote down 3 simple fraction problems for each girl, making sure one problem had a top number that wasn't 1. Both girls worked through each problem quickly and carefully, pausing briefly to repeat his instructions before finishing the last one. Gerald said, "I don't know why you girls think you can't do these problems. You both got them all right. Now go on, leave me alone for a bit." He used his best comedy voice, which made them laugh again. From behind him, he heard Pam say, "I just learned something that I never understood before. I always just used a calculator." Gwen replied, "Me too." "I think the reason is that Gerald acts just like a 10-year-old, said Gwen. Gerald felt embarrassed. He hadn't realized anyone was watching him. He finally stood up and looked at the 3 people standing at the door. "Come on, everyone," Gwen said. "It's time to divide our dinner into 6 parts." Everyone, including the girls, smiled and walked into the dining room. Gwen and Pam went to the kitchen and brought out a big dish of roast and vegetables. They also carried a large bowl of Gerald's beans, placing it right in front of Jim. "Okay, I've got my share," Jim said. Pam replied, "Not if you want to sleep in my bed tonight." The 4 adults chuckled, but the 2 girls looked puzzled. Dinner went well and everyone enjoyed their meal. Pam praised the potatoes and vegetables. Gwen shared that they came from her garden, which Gerald built. Gerald and Sherilyn helped plant the garden too. Pam expressed a desire to have a garden like that. Before he knew it, Gerald had another garden to tend. He thought he could probably start on Tuesday but might not be able to plant until Wednesday. The girls insisted on helping with the planting, so they planned to work on it after school on Wednesday. By the end of school, Jennifer and Sherilyn had become quite close friends. Jim had been chosen as sheriff and started his new role in mid-May. With Gwen's help, Gerald provided 4 types of bread and 10 gallons of his beans for the celebration. Although he couldn't grow enough beans in his own garden, he began making batches of beans to sell at the market. At first, sales were slow, but once people tried his beans, he sold out every weekend. He whimsically named them Lawman Beans, with the catchphrase, "Good enough to keep the lawman happy." Gwen was teaching summer school again, and Pam had a busy social calendar, so Jennifer and Sherilyn often spent their days with Gerald while he worked. The girls learned to weigh and measure everything, from lumber to water to flour and spices. One or both of them usually accompanied him to the market on Saturdays, earning a little money for their work. Like Gwen, Jim and Pam allowed her to keep half of what she made. During their free time, the 2 friends became proficient at shopping, comparing prices and qualities of items. They often discussed their choices and consulted Gerald when they were uncertain about something. Gerald even showed them how to use the internet to find information about products and ingredients. As a result of their experiences, both girls started to prefer a more natural look, having learned about the ingredients in makeup. Gerald also taught the girls about percentages and how they relate to fractions, which led to a lesson on decimals. He spread beans all over the table to explain these concepts. The girls quickly grasped many of the new ideas as he showed them examples and asked for their thoughts. They often conversed with each other before providing him with their answers. Gerald continued a practice from last summer where the girls would write about their activities. He would have them read and explain instructions or recipes to him. Sherilyn was already accustomed to this from the previous summer, but it only took Jennifer a couple of weeks to catch on. Jim and Pam hosted a big 4th of July party, and everyone attended. This led to discussions about the country's history. As usual, the girls had many questions, often beginning with, "Why?" Gerald would share stories and then ask them what they would have done if they were there. In late July, Jim, Pam, and Jennifer went on a 2-week vacation and invited Sherilyn to join them. They planned to drive through the East, including stops in Washington, D.C. and other places. Gerald encouraged them to keep a journal of their trip and gifted them colorful notebooks and pens for this purpose. While they were away, Gwen visited a prison and then spent a week with her parents. Gerald was busy, but he missed his friends and knew they would return soon. When Gwen got back, he invited her over for dinner. This was their first chance to talk alone for a while. Gwen brought up her marriage again. Gerald, while I was at the prison, he mentioned divorce again. It seems they will add at least another 10 years to his sentence. I talked a lot with my parents about it. They understand how I feel, but reminded me that I deserve to be happy. And Sherilyn also needs some closure. I want to think about this more and maybe make a decision later this year. Do you think that's a good idea? Gwen, I believe you'll know when you're ready to make that choice. It could be this year or next year, but you will feel it when the time comes. You and Sherilyn might want to discuss it more, as it may be harder for her to understand. Getting her thoughts before you decide will be important. We've talked a little. She still defends her dad, but she doesn't remember much about when he was around. I can see that Sherilyn looks up to Jenny and Jim's relationship, but she also talks about her bond with you in a similar way. I think it might be hard to know how she will feel about any final choice. Every time I chat with Sherilyn, I'm amazed at how much she's growing up. Her maturity always surprises me. I think that when you're ready, you'll also be impressed by her reactions. So I suggest you trust her. She knows what is happening even if she doesn't get all the details. Thanks. I really needed to hear that from someone else. I see it too, but as her mom, I was worried I might be overthinking things. Gerald smiled. Have you thought about what you'll do after a divorce, if it happens? Are you reading my mind? That's a question I ask myself a lot. Honestly, I probably think about that more than anything else. I'd love to travel to new places. I haven't seen much before. I envy Sherilyn's trip to the East Coast, but I would also like to see the West Coast, especially the Northwest. I know I could move to a big city and earn more from teaching, but living there would be more expensive, and I hear terrible stories about schools there. I really enjoy my students here. I love being in the classroom, but the state is adding more rules that seem to take time away from actual teaching. I barely have time for one-on-one with my students now. I'm really grateful that Sherilyn can talk to you about what she doesn't understand. You're a natural teacher, and she has really flourished since you started helping her with math and other subjects. Thanks, but I never thought of myself as a teacher. But you are. Your patience and ability to show lessons instead of just talking about them is what good teaching is all about. That's how it used to be. But anyway, I've made a decision. What is it, if you don't mind me asking? Of course I don't mind. I'm going to stay here until Sherry finishes high school. I might stay longer, but I won't move her before that. Maybe my personal dreams will come true after that, but I can be patient. Right now, it's more important for her to have stability in her life, and I guess I need that too. Gerald realized he had been holding his breath. He let out a long sigh and began to breathe normally again. He quietly said, I think that's a good choice. Me too. Gwen changed the topic. I'm thinking about bringing the internet back. It will be expensive, but I believe Sherry will need it more for school. Do you have any thoughts? Yes, I've been thinking about this for a while. I agree that Sherilyn needs it now, and will need it even more as she continues school. I've looked into it, and I'd like to try something first before you spend money on it. Oh, what do you want to try? Our houses are less than 100 yards apart. My internet can support 5 or 6 devices, but the Wi-Fi doesn't reach that far. I think I can run a cable from my house to yours. With a signal booster or a server, you can use the internet without paying extra. I'm already paying a lot for my service based on how much I use it. I wouldn't mind sharing with you and Sherilyn. You both would just be added users on my account. Will you get in trouble for doing that? If they ever checked, they might raise an issue, but I doubt they will. It's really no different than you having a laptop and using it here. I'd just run a wire along the fence to your house so you don't have to come over all the time. It sounds so easy, but I like the idea of having access here too. I could spend more time at home instead of being at school when it's time for grades and checking emails. She paused and nodded. Let's try it. If it doesn't work, I can still get my own internet service. I'll get the supplies tomorrow and we can check if it works before Sherry gets back. Can I come with you? Of course. Let's go after breakfast. Only if I make breakfast for you. Deal. After breakfast the next morning, they drove 30 miles to a discount computer store that had a bit of everything. They found a salesman who seemed to know a lot about networks. After Gerald explained that he wanted to set up a computer outlet in his barn about 100 yards from his house, the salesman suggested a small server instead of a signal booster. He said it would be more reliable and give a stronger signal. Gerald agreed and started picking out other things he would need. As they went to the checkout, he spotted a red laptop on a clearance shelf. "What's the deal with that laptop?" he asked the salesman. "That could be a good buy depending on what you want to do. A customer bought it for his son, but the boy turned out to be a big gamer. The laptop couldn't run some of his games, so 2 months later the dad returned it. We usually don't take back a laptop that's only 2 months old, especially with a couple of scratches, but since this customer spends a lot with us, we gave him trade-in credit for a more expensive one. But this one is still a good laptop, right?" "Yes, it is. Our service team checked it out, cleaned off everything the kid had on it, and made sure it was in good shape. It runs well. It can play videos and access the internet without any issues, and it has programs for writing and spreadsheets. However, it can't handle the big, complicated action games that kids often enjoy. For that price, I think I'll take it. I've been wanting to upgrade my home computer, and this deal is too good to miss." They placed it in the shopping cart and went through the checkout process. Once they were in the car, Gwen smiled at him and said, "So my house is now a barn, huh?" "Well, I might want to connect something to the barn someday," Gerald replied with a grin. "But your barn is 50 feet from your house." "Exactly. I need about 100 feet of cable to be safe." "So that's why you got 100 yards of cable." "Having a little extra means I won't have to make another trip." They both chuckled at their joke. When they got home, Gerald started figuring out how to run the cable. The old wiring was still there, so he began connecting the new cable to the old one. While he worked, Gwen received a phone call. She said she needed to go to the school for a while to look over her fall schedule and some other materials. Gerald waved her off and kept working. An hour later, he ran the cable along the fence to his house. He set up the server and plugged in his computer. It worked just like it always did. Next, he went to Gwen's house and plugged her computer in. It started up right away, and Gerald felt relieved. Lastly, he went into Sherilyn's room, set the laptop on her desk, and plugged it in. 5 minutes later, he typed, "Welcome home," on her screen, and left a note for Gwen to come over for dinner later. He fired up the grill and marinated 2 steaks while the baked potatoes cooked in the oven. Gwen arrived with a salad and a smile. "Thank you so much, Gerald. As soon as I got home, I tried out the computer, and it works great." She hugged him warmly. Gerald felt himself blush and said nothing. "By the way, Pam called while I was at school. They will probably be home the day after tomorrow in the afternoon. I told her we would have dinner when they returned." "Then I need to go to the store and get some beans," Gerald said. Gwen laughed and handed him 2 bags. "I thought you might need these." He smiled and put them in a pot to soak, then set the steaks on the table while Gwen set the table and checked the potatoes. On Friday, he carried a pot of beans and 2 loaves of bread up to Gwen's house, where she welcomed him with a smile. "They called and will be here in about an hour. Have a seat. I bought some drinks. I think Jim and Pam will appreciate it after watching 2 11-year-olds for 2 weeks." She handed Gerald a beverage. Gerald enjoyed drinks like these, but he rarely bought them for himself. An hour later, they heard a car pull up and went outside to greet the visitors. Both girls, Sherilyn and Jennifer, jumped out of the car, chattering away excitedly. They hugged Gwen and Gerald tightly. Jim and Pam stepped out next, stretching and looking tired from their trip. Gerald handed Jim a cold drink, and Jim took it with a grateful nod. Gwen offered Pam a glass, which she accepted with a smile. Sherilyn grabbed her bag from the car, and she and Jennifer dashed into her room. Before the adults could come inside, they heard a loud scream from Sherilyn. Gwen looked worried until Sherilyn came running back to hug her mom tightly. "Thank you so much, Mom. I love it. And it's red, too, my favorite color. And it has internet." She quickly let go of her mom and raced back to her room. Gwen, still a bit puzzled, turned to Jim and asked, "How much time would I get if I, had to take care of a man who really deserved it?" Jim looked surprised, but answered, "Maybe 5 years, 3 if you have a good lawyer." Pam joked, "If it was a man who truly deserved it and the jury was all women, they'd probably let you go and invite you to lunch. So, who's this guy that deserves it?" That guy over there. He bought Sherry a computer without even telling me, Gerald replied, feeling a mix of annoyance and embarrassment. Jim and Pam laughed out loud. Pam added, "Typical man. He does something nice but still deserves a talking to." Gerald turned red and said, "Just tell her it's from my royalty check this quarter." Gwen shot him a look and responded, "And I better see the proof when that check arrives." Gerald handed her their second quarter check. She looked at it and smiled, saying nothing more. An hour later, they finally managed to pull the girls away from Sherilyn's computer, where they'd set up all the social networks popular at the time. Just as they sat down, Jim said, "I thought I was fit enough to catch a bad guy, but I'm definitely not fit enough to keep up with these two." Everyone chuckled, and Pam nodded in agreement. On Saturday, Gerald went to the market alone, since Sherilyn had stayed up late and slept until almost noon. 2 weeks later, when school started, things settled back into their usual routine. The Sunday after the last market in October, Gerald was over for dinner, which was a bit delayed. After helping Sherilyn with her homework, Gwen suggested he watch the evening news while she finished up. As he watched, he froze when he saw a story about a new factory opening 100 miles away. They were interviewing the factory manager. Once the story was over, Gerald stood up a bit shaky and walked into the kitchen with tears in his eyes. He apologized to Gwen, saying he had to leave. Then he went out the door and headed home. An hour later, a worried Gwen knocked on his door, carrying a plate of dinner for him. His tears had dried, but the sadness was evident on his face. "Gerald, you have always been here for me. Please talk to me. What happened?" "I'm sorry, Gwen. I just saw something on the news that upset me." "Please tell me." Gerald looked very sad. "They showed that story about the new plant?" She nodded. "The plant manager was my ex-wife's boyfriend. That was her next to him." "I'm sorry, Gerald. I know this is hard for you." "Actually, that didn't hurt me as much as I thought it would. What really hit me was seeing my 2 kids standing next to her." Tears started to roll down his face again. Gwen looked at him in shock. He had never spoken much about his ex-wife, and she had no idea he had children. It felt like a whole new side of Gerald was opening up before her, and she was not ready for it. Finally, she said, "You never mentioned them, and I never thought—" He got up, went to his bedroom, and returned with 2 boxes, placing them next to her. Then he went to get a drink of water. She opened one box and saw school pictures of children in their early grades. She noticed envelopes marked "Moved, Address Unknown." Then she found letters written each week, with the last one dated that very morning. The recent letters were short but still in pristine condition, not ready to be sent out. He had just kept them in case something happened. He returned and sat back on the sofa. Gwen found it hard to speak at first. "Gerald, I don't know what to say except that I'm sorry you've been through this. I feel like I'm reading a story that isn't mine to read." "No, Gwen, don't feel that way. I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't quite understand everything myself. I guess today was just the day fate wanted me to share this with you. I didn't do it very well. You did okay from my side. I can see you haven't figured out what to do yet." "No, I'm still trying to process all of this. But I will talk to you before I make any decisions. I think I'll need some help figuring things out." "I'll be here whenever you want to talk." "Thanks, Gwen. I really appreciate your support. You might not know how much I value your help, too. Now let me heat up your dinner in the microwave. You need to eat. I need to talk to Sherry soon. Please don't say anything to her about this. I can hardly talk to you about it, and talking to her would be even harder." "I get it. I won't say a word to her." She warmed up his dinner. After he sat down to eat, she gave him a hug and walked back home. A week and a half later, he called Gwen and asked her to come over after school. She dropped Sherilyn off at home and walked down to his place. She found him at the kitchen table with 2 envelopes and 2 letters. She sat down and waited for him to say something. "Gwen, I've been thinking. I don't know what they told Rick and Denise about me or why I haven't reached out to them. So I don't think it's a good idea to just go up to them. I decided to write them each another letter and send it to the plant. I hope it will help ease things up for them. What do you think?" She thought for a moment. This seemed like a good way for Gerald to protect himself if things didn't go well. "I think it's a smart idea, Gerald. It opens the door without putting too much pressure on you or the kids." "That's what I was thinking, too. I'll mail these in the morning." 2 weeks later, she and Sherilyn came over for dinner. She noticed the 2 envelopes on the table. They were both marked, "Return to sender, no person at this address." Gwen looked at Gerald and saw he seemed defeated. "Gerald, I have an idea. Can I try something to see what's going on?" Gerald answered in a tired tone, "Sure. I don't have a better plan." After dinner, Gerald sat with Sherilyn to help her with her homework. Gwen stepped outside onto the porch with her phone and called Jim. "Jim, it's Gwen. I won't go into details right now, but a few weeks ago, there was news about a plant opening a couple of counties away. Do you know anyone there who can help find out about the plant manager?" "Yes, I know the sheriff there. We've worked together on a few cases." "What do you need to know? Is this work or personal?" "It's personal. I don't have much information. The news interviewed a guy who Gerald thought he might know but wasn't sure. He tried to reach him with a letter but didn't hear back. Just wondering if it's the same guy and if he is nearby." "That shouldn't be a problem. I'll call the sheriff in the morning and let you know what he finds out." "Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate it." "Gwen, there's more to this story, right?" "Yes, but let's hold off on that until you find out something." "All right." The next afternoon, Jim drove into Gwen's driveway while Gerald was inside helping Sherilyn and Jennifer with their homework. "Gerald, can you come outside for a minute?" Gwen called to him. "Sure, be right there." "Keep working on this and I'll be back soon," Gerald said. He stepped outside and saw Gwen talking to Jim. He shook hands with Jim and then looked at Gwen, curious. "I asked Jim to talk to the sheriff over there to find out some information," Gwen explained. They both turned to Jim. "Well, here's an interesting story. He came to our town with his family and got a real estate agent to show him around. He claimed he was looking for a site to build a factory that would create many jobs. That grabbed people's attention, even a local news station that interviewed him. When he finally met with the city council about it, they learned he was just a promoter for a group of investors wanting to build a plant to process toxic waste. They would hire at most 20 people and wanted the city to give them free land and no taxes for 20 years. The council said no, and he left behind only a phone number to call. After some checking, they found out he had made the same offer in several other towns in different states. Gerald and Gwen exchanged disappointed looks. "Gwen mentioned you might know this guy, Gerald?" Jim asked. "Yeah, he used to be my boss. He has something of mine," Gerald replied. "Is it valuable?" Jim asked. "It means a lot to me," Gerald answered. "Thanks for looking into this, Jim. I figured it would be a long shot anyway." Gerald then re-entered the house to join the girls. Jim looked at Gwen with a raised eyebrow. "The woman was Gerald's ex-wife," Gwen said. "Oh, how about the kids?" Jim asked. Gwen turned to him and said, "Thank you, Jim. Both of us appreciate it. I'll make sure Jenny is home after dinner." Jim understood and gave her a supportive hug without asking more questions. The rest of the fall went by without any major issues. Gerald felt more energetic and enthusiastic. A bright point was that their quarterly royalty check was the largest yet. They celebrated at a new Mexican restaurant in town with Jim and Jenny. Pam had a meeting that night. They spent Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's as they had in the past, with Jim, Pam, and Jenny being more involved in the celebrations than before. Years 4 and 5. The new year started peacefully, with no problems. It had been a cold winter, and Gerald was almost out of firewood. He was chopping more wood when Sherilyn and Gwen came down his way, bundled up against the cold. He stopped his work and led them inside. He offered hot coffee, but quickly made hot chocolate for Sherilyn. They all sat down, and Gerald noticed that Sherilyn seemed very quiet and shy, something he hadn't seen from her in years. Gerald said, "Let me guess. Someone wants something but feels shy about asking." Gwen smiled and encouraged, "Go on, Sherry." "Mom, this is so hard," Sherilyn said, looking nervous. "Honey, there will be many hard things in life. Just take a deep breath and say it. Gerald is not going to yell at you," Gwen reassured her. Sherilyn took a moment and then began to speak. Gerald, in a couple of weeks the school is having a party, and I was wondering if you would go with me." Her face was red, and she looked anxious. Gerald glanced at Gwen, who was looking at Sherilyn. "That was the hard part, Sherry. Now tell him the rest." Sherilyn's eyes glanced up at her mother and then back at Gerald. She quickly said, "It's a father-daughter Valentine's Day dinner party," and then looked down at her lap again. Gerald lifted her chin so she could see him and said, "Of course I would be very happy to go to the Valentine's dinner party with you." A smile spread across her face, and she hugged him tightly. "Thank you, thank you," Gwen beamed at them. Sherilyn then dashed over to his computer to send a message to Jenny. Gerald and Gwen stepped out onto the porch with their freshly filled coffee cups and sat in their rocking chairs. "What was all that about?" Gerald asked. "When this party came up, Sherilyn felt she couldn't go because her dad isn't here. Jenny told her that you could take her instead. Sherilyn asked me what I thought about that, and I said it was a great idea. But then she got shy because it's a Valentine's Day dinner." "Oh, I understand." "She asked me to ask you for her. I told her that I thought it would be better if she asked you herself. As you saw, it was like a boy asking a girl out for the first time. She's starting to notice boys a little, and she talks about them a lot with Jenny but feels embarrassed talking about it even with me." Gerald smiled. "I guess she's growing up just fine, huh?" "I hope so. You've done a wonderful job raising her, Gwen." "Thanks." Sherilyn came outside and looked at him. Without a word, she climbed into Gerald's lap. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" "Of course." He wrapped his arms around her to keep her warm. "Jenny and I were talking, and we think that you must have a daughter, do you?" Gerald shot a glance at Gwen, who shook her head slightly. "Why do you think that?" he asked. "Because you do all the dad things so well. We think you must have had practice." "Okay, yes, I do have a daughter and a son. Their names are Denise and Rick." "You don't talk about them. Do you see them or talk to them?" Gerald spoke softly. "No, Sherry, I don't. I don't know where they are. And as far as I know, they don't know where I am." He felt a lump in his throat. Sherilyn stayed quiet for a moment as she thought. Gwen and Gerald exchanged glances. After a deep breath, Sherilyn seemed to make a decision. "Gerald, my mom said that my real dad won't be coming home for a long, long time. I don't like not having a dad, so will you be my substitute dad?" "I would like to be your second dad," Sherilyn said. Gerald looked at her and replied, "Don't you think you should talk to your mom first? She might have something to say about that." Sherilyn turned to her mom with a hopeful look. Gwen took a moment to think and then said, "Sherry, most of us don't choose who our dad is. I think you picked a great choice for a second dad, and you'll be very lucky if Gerald agrees." Sherilyn smiled and looked back at Gerald. He smiled and answered, "I would be proud to be your dad, and even prouder to have you as my daughter." They celebrated their new bond with a warm embrace. To celebrate, Gerald brought out pizza dough, and they made homemade pizzas. They raised glasses to their new relationship with wine for the adults and grape juice for Sherilyn. After dinner, Sherilyn asked, "Daddy, I don't know when your birthday is. A daughter should know her dad's birthday." "All right, but you have to tell me yours too. My birthday is July 15th, he said. Sherilyn began to giggle as Gerald looked puzzled. Finally, she said, "That's funny. Mine is July 15th too. I won't forget yours, and Mom won't have to remind me." They shared a warm hug, and Gwen smiled with joy. The next 2 weeks went smoothly, but as the big day got closer, Gerald became more nervous. He hadn't worn a coat and tie in almost 5 years and wasn't sure how the other parents would react. Unsure of what to do, he asked Gwen for help. After explaining his worries, Gwen replied, "I can't help you choose your outfit, but I assure you some dads will dress up while others will wear just a shirt. Just be comfortable, and don't worry about the other parents. You might be surprised at how well known you are in the community and at school. Your name comes up often at the PTA meetings. Also, it's tradition for the dad to buy a small Valentine corsage for his daughter, and she will buy you a gift too. Just be yourself." Gerald visited several flower shops to look for corsages. Most of them seemed too fancy for him. Finally, he bought 4 rosebuds and some ribbon to make his own. He spent more time than he expected on it, but was happy with the result. He put it in the refrigerator to keep it fresh for dinner the next night. The next evening, he wore his slacks and sport coat with a tie, taking his corsage to pick up Sherilyn. He had washed his truck that afternoon. Despite Gwen's words of encouragement, he still felt a bit anxious. But as he walked up to the door, he shifted his focus from himself to Sherilyn and promised to make this the best Valentine's Day he could. Gwen greeted him at the door and exclaimed how nice he looked all dressed up. Then she asked him to stand in the living room while she went to help Sherilyn come out. As soon as Sherilyn entered the room, all his worries disappeared. She wore a pink dress with dark red trim that he had never seen before. Her hair looked nice, and she had just a touch of makeup on. Her smile brightened the whole room. "Sherry, you look so lovely tonight." "Thank you, Dad. Mom said you look great tonight, but I think you're really handsome." "I brought you a corsage. I might need your mom to help me pin it on, though. I'm not very good at that kind of thing." Sherilyn laughed. Gwen smiled and shook her head. When he gave her the corsage, she gently touched it and said how pretty it was. At the center was a big pink rosebud that was just starting to open. On top was a red rosebud, and on either side were 2 white buds. "Gerald Lambert, please make your entrance." As Sherilyn and Gerald stepped into the spotlight, Gerald felt a wave of pride wash over him. The crowd cheered lightly, and he could see the smiles on the faces of their friends and family. Sherilyn beamed, her excitement palpable, and he couldn't help but smile back. Next, the announcer called for Jenny and Jim. The moment they entered, the cheers grew louder, with Jenny practically glowing as she held her medallion. Jim stood tall, pride evident in his demeanor as he introduced Jenny to everyone around. The evening continued with laughter and storytelling, creating an atmosphere filled with warmth and love. Gerald and Gwen exchanged knowing glances, both grateful for the bonds that were being celebrated that night. As the festivities unfolded, the focus remained on the connections shared between parents and children, making this a memorable occasion for all. Gerald Murphy. Gerald took Sherilyn's arm, and they walked into the cafeteria to applause. Moments later they heard, "Miss Jennifer Sanders and her dad, Mr. James Sanders," and the crowd cheered for them, too. They found their seats next to each other and sat down. After a few minutes, a man whispered to Jim, who then excused himself for a bit. When he came back, he was wearing clean pants and a white shirt with a tie that showed off his medallion. Gerald noticed that while many introductions said father, just as many used dad or daddy. He felt proud that Sherilyn chose to call him Daddy. Dinner was nice, with chicken, rice, and steamed vegetables. Both girls loudly whispered that Gerald made better food. The other girls giggled at this, and Gerald smiled in response. After dinner, they mingled at the other end of the cafeteria, which was decorated with handmade hearts. Jim introduced Gerald to several other fathers, showing that he was well known among the parents. There was music, punch, and cake. Many fathers and daughters danced together, including Sherilyn and Gerald. After a while, the girls began dancing with each other in groups, while the fathers enjoyed watching proudly from the side. Before the night ended, a younger man approached Gerald and introduced himself as the school principal. "I've heard about you, Mr. Murphy. Both Jennifer and Sherilyn have told everyone how much you've helped them with math and other subjects," he said. "I was hoping you might want to help some of our 3rd and 4th graders who are having trouble with math. We are getting close to testing time, and these kids really need support." Gerald looked surprised and replied, "I haven't done that before, except with Jenny and Sherry. I'm not sure my way of teaching would be right for a school. The kids we are talking about have been getting regular teaching, but they still don't understand. I'm willing to give this a chance. If even half of them learn something, I will be happy. I can pay you for your time. It's not a lot, but it's something. I can do it on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday mornings. I get busy later in the week," he said. "That's fine. My wife buys your bread and beans from the market almost every week. If you could work with them on those mornings for a couple of hours, that would be perfect." "Okay, I'll give it a try. Thank you very much. Come to my office on Monday, and I will show you the room you can use and introduce you to the children. I also have someone who can help you if you need it. I'll be there at about 9 o'clock. "Great! I'm looking forward to it." The principal left with a smile. Jim, who had been nearby, looked at Gerald and smiled. "I think you might have gotten yourself into something big without realizing it." "Jim, it can't be that bad, can it?" Gerald asked. "Come over for dinner Monday night, and I'll have some drinks for you. Bring Sherry and Gwen. Gwen will probably need to drive you home." Gerald smiled at his friend and said, "All right, but I don't think I'll need the drinks before bed." "We'll see about that." The girls came up and asked if they could stop for ice cream before going home. The two agreed, and they enjoyed ice cream on a chilly night. When they got home, Gerald and Sherilyn shared their day. As Sherilyn got ready for bed, Gerald told Gwen about his agreement with the principal and Jim's playful tease. She smiled and said, "You're going to do great, but Jim is right too. These kids will be different from Sherry and Jenny, and some may challenge your patience. But I believe you can handle it. You have a way of connecting with people. Let's see how you feel on Monday night." After a warm hug from Sherilyn, Gerald went home. He took off his medallion and hung it up next to his chair and computer. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to each of his children, sharing about his evening and wishing they could have been with him. He put the letters in their boxes and went to bed. The next day, he was busy baking and getting ready for Saturday's market. When the girls came home from school, they helped him bake and rolled more buns for Friday's cooking. They enjoyed making the buns because they could chat and listen to music while they worked. The music wasn't Gerald's favorite, but he thought it was much better than a lot of other music out there. Gwen came by to pick up the girls to go to Jim and Pam's house for a sleepover. She also invited Gerald to join them for a late dinner since she had to stop at the store. They agreed to meet for dinner at 7:30. During dinner, Gwen gave him a list of the students he would be working with and shared details about each one. She only did this when Sherilyn wasn't present and asked him not to mention the kids when she was around. Gerald nodded. She highlighted 3 students in particular. The first was Roberto. He was smart, but often seemed to follow his older brother, who was involved with a local gang. So far, the brother had only gotten into small trouble, but many believed it was only a matter of time before things got worse. The second was Susanna, who went by Susie. She did well in school, but often seemed to forget what she learned by the next day, which confused everyone. The third was a bright and cheerful boy named Dwayne. He had decided he wanted to be a professional football or basketball player and didn't think school was important. He was friendly, but he avoided everyone's efforts to inspire him. Gerald listened carefully as she talked about each student and asked a few questions. After he got home, he spent an hour online reading about how children develop and learn. While he didn't find exact answers for working with these kids, it gave him some ideas to think about over the weekend. On Monday, he arrived right at 9 o'clock and met the principal, who welcomed him warmly again. The principal took him to a room next to the library. There was a table and 7 chairs set up. He told Gerald to make himself comfortable while he went to get the 3rd graders. There were 6 of them, including Susie. He had brought some beans and a few other items to use, but first he wanted to get to know the kids better, so he asked them to introduce themselves and share their names and dreams for the future. He spent the rest of the hour listening to their names and their hopes. He took notes in a notebook he had brought. When the bell rang, he stretched and waited for the 4th graders to arrive. He was surprised by how different the 4th graders were from the 3rd graders. The younger kids talked freely about themselves and had all sorts of dreams, both realistic and not so realistic, for their lives. The older students had started to pull away and share less about themselves and their dreams. Once they finished talking, there were still a few students left in the class. Gerald checked the clock, gathered up his notes, and asked 4 students to follow him. He told the other 2 to stay put for a bit. Gerald and the 4 students walked up to the librarian. Gerald said, "Can you help these 4 find a book about jobs? Something realistic, not fantasy?" The librarian smiled and nodded. Gerald turned to the students. "I want each of you to read a book about the careers you mentioned. After that, write me a report on what you need to do to get there. Can you do that?" They all replied with yes. Gerald smiled and nodded to the librarian, who showed them to the section about careers. While they were busy, Gerald went back to the classroom and sat down, looking at the 2 students who remained. Dwayne spoke up, saying, "Hey, I thought you were going to make us math wizards." Roberto giggled. Gerald replied, "First, I'm not dude. I'm Gerald. Second, I can't make you a math wizard, only you can achieve that. I can only help you right now." Roberto laughed again, but Dwayne's smile faded a bit as he looked at Gerald. Gerald continued, "I think both of you are quite alike in your personalities and job choices." Dwayne jumped in. "No way! I want to be a top football or basketball player. He just wants to be a bad guy. We're nothing alike." Roberto grinned at this. Gerald shook his head gently. "Actually, you are alike. Both of you have the smarts to do whatever you want, but you've decided on careers that might not last long. Dwayne, if you do reach the professional level, You might be lucky to play for 10 years. Many athletes have careers that last 3 years or even less. After that, you could find yourself with nothing to do. You might have some money, but if you don't save it well, it won't be enough to live on, so you might end up living at home with your parents. Dwayne looked serious and did not smile. And you, Roberto, Gerald continued, want to join your brother in his gang? There's no promise they'll listen to you or follow you. If Dwayne's job is short, yours is even shorter. Many people in gangs end up facing severe consequences before they even turn 21. Once you have a record, getting a job can be very hard. That's not a good life if you want to have a family someday. You don't have to trust everything I say, but you are smart enough to look up facts about the jobs you want. Don't just read the exciting parts. Read how things really are. Just then, Gerald glanced at the clock and realized class was almost over. Dwayne, I suggest you ask the librarian for a book called Brian's Song. It's a true story about 2 football teammates and what they went through. It is true, and yes, one of them is in the Hall of Fame. What happened to the other one? Read the book and see for yourself. Roberto scoffed. What do you want me to read? Roberto, I can't tell you what to do. I don't know what you want to achieve. I just think you should learn about what happens to gang members and think about it. Tomorrow we will start with math. Then the bell rang, and the 2 students left. Gerald picked up his bag and headed toward the office. In the hallway, he met Gwen. Hi. How did it go today? Mostly well. I asked the kids to share about themselves and what they wanted to be when they grew up. I had the 4th graders find a book about their career choice to read and write a report for me. Having them read, that's cool. Well, you can't do math if you can't read. Or maybe I should say, you can do math better if you think of it as a story. To me, they just go together. What about the 3 I told you about? Susie was quiet, so I couldn't learn much. I will find out more tomorrow and Wednesday, but I have an idea I want to try. If I can connect with Dwayne, I think I can help him. He needs a reality check. I'm not sure about Roberto. He has built strong walls around himself and uses a tough attitude to hide his true feelings. I've never met someone like him before. I'll have to see how it goes and hope something resonates with him. If you need any help, just ask. My planning time is in the morning, so I can assist if you need it. Gerald grinned and said, Thanks. I will reach out if I need it. I'm going to check out with the principal and see you tonight. Are you and Sherry in for tacos tonight? Sherry always wants tacos, and I might be persuaded if you make some with chicken. I already planned that. Come over when you get home. We'll be there. Gerald checked out at the office and then stopped at the store on his way home. When he got home, he cut more wood because he had 2 orders to finish after school on Tuesday. Then he started preparing the meat for tacos and baking the shells. Chopping the lettuce, tomatoes, and grating the cheese could wait until they arrived. Sherilyn and Gwen came over at 7 o'clock, and soon they were enjoying his tacos. Sherilyn was still excited about the Valentine's party and was happy to see his medallion hanging on the wall next to his chair. After they went home, Gerald sat in his chair and wrote a variety of math problems for the students to work on the next day. He wrote special problems for Dwayne and Roberto to focus on. The next morning, before the 3rd graders began, he called Susie aside and gave her a tablet. He asked her to write down all the steps for every problem they worked on today. She smiled and said she would. He took out the beans, and soon the students were chatting about their answers and helping each other solve their problems. When they finished, Gerald took a quick look at their work. Everyone had done well, with only a few wrong answers. The 4th graders came in and they followed the same routine. Roberto looked bored while Dwayne watched but didn't join in the conversation. When Gerald handed out the worksheets, he asked Roberto and Dwayne to work together. They both stared at their papers in surprise. The other kids began working and talking to each other. Dwayne started to speak, but Gerald signaled for them to come to a small table on the side. Once they sat down, Dwayne said, "These problems are different from what the others have. What's going on?" "The thing is, both of you have big dreams and don't want to worry about what the other kids are doing. These problems use the same math as the others, but they relate to things that you both need to think about. You both can do this work, and you need to practice with these kinds of problems if you want to be successful. Just give it a try." They had 2 problems to solve. The first problem was about a contract worth $150,000. If they got the contract, they would need to pay a part to an agent, a part to a manager, and a part for taxes. The question was how much money they would have left after these payments. The second problem was about an order of 100 computers at a specific cost. When the shipment arrived, they found that some computers were damaged and some were missing. The question was what part of the original shipment was still good to sell and how much money they had lost during shipping. The other kids had similar problems but with smaller numbers and simpler details. Would the connections he forged be strong enough to withstand the shadows of his past, or was he destined to lose everything again? Stay tuned as the story deepens. Subscribe now and don't miss the next gripping chapter of Gerald's journey from despair to redemption.